I am Ryan McKnight.
I'm Cara Santamaria.
I am Christopher Smith.
Hi, I'm Andrew Torres.
This is Naked Mormonism,
the serial Mormon history podcast. What makes somebody a serial criminal? I'm not talking about, John Harvey Kellogg, who invented, pressed cornflakes that everybody eats for breakfast and then also convinced generations of Christians to mutilate the penises of their babies for generations. I'm talking about a different kind of serial criminal. Serial criminals operate patternistically. If a serial thief, they hit similar places in similar ways. A serial murderer usually targets specific people and has a specific method of killing their victims. Serial criminals commit their crimes in a series by developing a system with which they're comfortable to continue to commit those crimes for as long as possible. Career criminals can be serial criminals, but not all serial criminals are career criminals. The object of our focus was both. Whether treasure digging in New York or stealing people's businesses and printing money in Kirtland, waging war against the state of Missouri, or inciting insurrection in Illinois, Joseph Smith was a career criminal. He was also a serial criminal. From an early age, he was able to identify marks and exploit them through deliberate fraud. It happened in a serial fashion, and it enabled him to do some incredibly illegal and abusive things. It enabled him to grow a following of 6 people to 16,000 people, to bleed them dry of every resource they had, even to the point of giving up their lives for his cause. And he became an exalted figure, a god among humans. He wielded complete and total control over these people because he was a serial predator. And yes, his serial predatory behavior is nowhere better revealed than when we talk about polygamy. Polygamy and the attendant sexual dynamics are complicated topics, especially when we consider the public image and morality of a man who claimed to speak for God, a God which evolved from the puritanical roots of Western Christian Protestantism. This isn't an easy topic to navigate, and I'm going to do my best to allow the people to speak for themselves as we tell their stories. Yeah, you saw the right timestamp. That's not an error. We have 42 pages of scripts to get through today, and I'm not even making you wait 9 months for each episode that's 3 hours long like some other history podcasters. We're going to get into some controversial material today. We'll be talking about coercive and destructive practices, sexual abuse, grooming and child rape and sex trafficking, as well as some of the complexities that came along with these social structures of clandestine polygamy. Fair warning, this may not be everybody's favorite episode, and there may be some material that you don't want to hear, but I'm going to warn you before getting into the most disturbing content. That said, not every story today is an abusive fiend that we'll dredge from the pits of historical infamy, because we'll also discuss some success stories and people who probably enjoyed and certainly socially benefited from polygamy. Not all polygamy stories are alike. Let's get started at the beginning, when Joseph Smith began to enter the public consciousness in the early 1820s. In 1823, as the story goes, an angel appeared to Joseph Smith and told him about a set of gold plates buried in a hill nearby. Now, this much you probably know from Joe's official history, but you probably don't know the details of his failed attempt to get the plates the following day, unless you've listened to the show from the beginning or you read a few of the best books on the subject. According to several different accounts from both Mormon and non-Mormon sources, the story went something like this. When Moroni appeared to him in a vision on the night of September 21st, 1823, the autumnal equinox, he told Joe not to lay the plates down or put them for a moment out of his hands until he got into the house and deposited them in a chest or trunk having a good lock and key. Unfortunately, Joe didn't follow this instruction. He went to the hill in the early hours of the morning on September 22nd and dug up the supposed plates, and he lifted them out of the stone box that they had been buried in, and then he set them down on the ground and turned around to see if there was anything else in the box. When he turned back to the plates, they were gone. Turning back to the box, Joe found that the plates had teleported back inside the box. Also in the box was the angel in the form of a toad. Joe tried to pull the plates out of the box again, but the toad angel prevented it. According to Joseph Knight, Joe found the plates immovable. And Lucy Mack Smith, his mom, says that the angel knocked him down with a wave of invisible force. Oliver Cowdery said that the angel shocked him 3 times. Willard Chase says the toad struck him on the head and knocked him down multiple times. Orlando Saunders said the toad transformed into a giant flaming monster with glittering eyes until it seemed to fill the heavens, and with a blow like lightning, it swept him from the mountain into the valley beneath. At this point, Joe asked the angel, "Why can I not get these plates?" The angel, by this point, had transformed back into human shape from its magic amphibian origins, explained that he couldn't have them right now because he hadn't followed the instruction not to set the plates down. Joe asked, "When can I have them?" And the angel answered, "Come 1 year from this day and bring with you your oldest brother, and you shall have them." Obviously, Joe told a lot of different stories about this attempt to get the plates, which isn't surprising because Joe never really bothered much with, trying to be consistent with details about his visionary experiences in the woods. But the different versions of the stories share some common elements, and the instruction to bring Alvin, his older brother, to the hill the following year is mentioned by both a Mormon source, Joseph Knight, and a non-Mormon source, Willard Chase. The instruction to bring Alvin to the hill became a problem because less than a month after this occurrence, Alvin unexpectedly died in his mid-20s. Here the story takes a bit of a dark turn because it kind of seems like Joe may have dug up his brother's body or some portion of it in order to take him to the hill. On September 25th, 1824, Joseph Smith Sr. published an article to refute rumors that someone had stolen Alvin's body. Now, it seems way too coincidental that this was published just a few days after Joe was supposed to take Alvin to the hill just a year after the first, encounter with the spirit. Now, there's plenty of mystery surrounding what exactly happened here, and reasonable historians disagree, but Joe exhuming Alvin for this magic ritual is how I tend to kind of interpret the available evidence. For the next couple of years, Joe continued to insist that in order to get the plates, he needed to take, quote-unquote, the right person to the hill. For a little while, he thought it might be one of his fellow treasure seers, Samuel T. Lawrence, but then he changed his mind about that pretty quickly because Lawrence possibly wanted a larger cut of the gold plates and whatever else was in the box than Joe was willing to part with. This disagreement infected the entire treasure-digging group as Joe eventually cut all of them out. And then, of course, Sally Chase and Luman Walters attempted to steal the plates after Joe had basically made the set and did so without success. By this point, you're probably asking yourself, I thought we were going to talk about polygamy this episode. What does this story have to do with anything, especially considering that we've already discussed basically all of this earlier in the series and on the early episodes of the podcast? Well, I implore you, dear listener, be patient. It's about to take a turn towards sexual elements because in the fall of 1825, Joe met a desirable woman named Emma Hale when he boarded for a few months in her father's home in Harmony, Pennsylvania during the Josiah Stowell treasure dig. When he returned to New York, he couldn't stop thinking about her, and so, as Joe was wont to do, he searched his toolbox of manipulation to find the exact tool to accomplish his heart's desires. Step 1. According to Lucy Mack Smith, Joe took his parents aside one day and said he'd been lonely since Alvin died, and he wanted to get married, and he thought Emma Hale was the woman who would make him happy. His parents were delighted, and they invited Joe to bring Emma home to live with them. Step 2. In fall 1826, the same year the first U.S. patent for an internal combustion engine was filed, Joe followed treasure seer Samuel Lawrence and told him that he discovered a rich vein of silver in Pennsylvania, and he wanted Lawrence to take him there. Now, Samuel Lawrence didn't believe him, but Joe pinky swore and told Lawrence that if there was no treasure, quote, I will bind myself to be your servant for 3 years, end quote. So, Samuel Lawrence agreed, and he not only provided transportation, but also covered all of the expenses of the trip because Joe was, of course, broke. He was always broke. He was perpetually broke. On the way, Joe insisted that they stop at the Hale home, and he successfully badgered Samuel Lawrence into vouching for him to the Hales, claiming that Joe was a good guy and he was fit to marry their daughter, Emma Hale. Samuel Lawrence begrudgingly vouched for Joe, and when they finally went onward to look for the silver mine, of course they found nothing and went home with their pockets lighter than when they started. Step 3. Joe went to live and work with Joseph Knight in Colesville, New York, so that he could be closer to Emma, just about 40 miles actually. And he periodically visited her during this time and eventually asked her father, Isaac Hale, for Emma's hand in marriage. Her father refused because Joe followed a lifestyle unfit for his daughter. Step 4. Joe's former employer, Josiah Stowell, arranged for Emma to visit his house so that Joe could clandestinely meet with her away from the scornful eyes of Isaac. Emma later told her son, quote, "I had no intention of marrying when I left home, but during my visit at Mr. Stowell's, your father visited me there. My folks were bitterly opposed to him, and being importuned by your father, aided by Mr. Stowell, who urged me to marry him, and preferring to marry him to any other man I knew, I consented." End quote. In other words, Joe enlisted the help of an adult that Emma trusted, and then ambushed her with a marriage proposal, and the two men badgered her until she said yes. Emma settled on Joe, and one can't help but wonder how she kind of regarded that memory later in life. Like, maybe she would have taken a different path, to wonder what was and what could have been had things been different or she made a different decision. I can only imagine that her mind carried these thoughts from time to time. And finally, step 5, Joe showed up on January 17, 1827, while Isaac was at church and absconded with Emma to South Bainbridge, where they were married on January 18th. In order to escape the withering castigation of Isaac, Joe and Emma eloped. There's a detail in this courtship process which tends to escape examination. When Joe had that meeting with Emma at Josiah Stowell's house, part of his argument to her was apparently that the angel had told him that she was the right person to come to the hill with him to get the plates. According to Joe's neighbor, Lorenzo Saunders, quote, "Joseph's wife was a pretty woman, as pretty a woman as I ever saw. When she came to the Smiths, she was disappointed and used to come to our house and sit down and cry. She said she was deceived and got into a hard place. Joe said in our house to my mother, the angel said he must get him a wife and take her and go and get the plates." End quote. Mormon Joseph Knight and non-Mormon Henry Harris also confirm that Joe told them the angel required him to marry Emma and bring her to the hill. This helps explain why both Samuel Lawrence and Josiah Stowell may have been willing to recommend Joe to Emma, because they were invested in Joe getting the plates, and he told them that the marriage was necessary, that this was a necessary step in order to acquire the plates. Emma's opinion in the matter seems to be basically an obstacle to overcome instead of being a human's feelings necessary to take into consideration and to respect. Right here in Joe's very first marriage proposal, he laid the groundwork for all of the toxic tactics he would use in later marriage proposals. He insisted that an angel required the woman to marry him, and he recruited friends to help him convince the woman to go along with it, to operate as his liaison. That story about how Emma always came over to the Saunders house to cry and to complain that she was deceived, that was a harbinger which foreshadowed patterns which would emerge in Mormon polygyny over a decade and a half later. At this point, the story takes an interesting turn. On September 21st, 1827, Joe loaded Emma into a wagon with a blanket, and he took her to the hill at night to get the plates. The angel also had other magical requirements for the trip. Joe had to wear all black, he had to ride a black horse, and so on and so forth. And we don't really have any detailed accounts of what happened up there that night, except that apparently Joe left Emma in the wagon about 40 rods away while he went and got the plates and hid them in a hollow oak tree. What we do know is that Joe took his hot young bride up the hill in a wagon with the blanket, and they were gone all night, and Emma delivered her firstborn son exactly 268 days later. That's an interesting period of time because it's precisely the average gestation period of a human. Now, sexual consummation isn't an uncommon sealing or binding method in magical practices, and the newlyweds, let's be honest, the newlyweds rarely had any alone time in the crowded Smith home. So, unfortunately, a malformed Alvin was born and lived for just a few hours, just 9 months after that night of acquiring the plates. So yes, what I'm saying is acquisition of the plates very likely included a performative sexual act between Joe and Emma on the hill that night. The angel Moroni must have been some kind of a peeping Tom. After the plates were supposedly acquired, Joe's definitions of sexuality and divinely sanctioned relationships seem to have expanded. Now, historians spend a lot of time bickering over Fanny Alger and what probably happened between her and Joe sometime from 1832 to 1836. Well, Joe's sexual experimentation predates Fanny by half a decade. The first evidence we have of this is Joe's attempted seduction of a girl named Eliza Winters during the translation of the Book of Mormon in Harmony, Pennsylvania in 1828. Harmony resident Levi Lewis said he was acquainted with both Joe and Martin Harris during this period, quote, and has heard them both say adultery was no crime. Harris said he did not blame Smith for his, Smith's, attempt to seduce Eliza Winters, etc., end quote. Now, rumors and public charges of adultery plagued Mormonism even while the Book of Mormon itself was being authored 2 years before the church was started. We don't know very much about this incident, but a person named Ramanthus, I'm not sure exactly how to say that person's name, Ramanthus M. Stalker, confirms that Eliza Winters spent a lot of time at the Smith home during this period, and at age 70, Eliza gave a short interview to the Broome Republican newspaper in which she said and confirmed that she lived in the neighborhood. We also have a court document in which Eliza Winters sued Martin Harris for defamation because he said that she had a bastard child. Apparently, she asked for $1,000 in damages. Now, it could totally be the case that Eliza had Joe's bastard child here, but I'm not really thinking that. Levi Lewis refers to Joe's attempt to seduce her, which suggests that Joe didn't actually succeed in seducing her. And of course, the term seducing is a very loaded and complicated term in the entirety of the episode we're discussing today. We know from later events that Joe's modus operandi when women rejected him was to smear them and to destroy their reputations. So I assume that that's what he did with Eliza Winters. And I doubt that she would have risked taking him, Martin Harris, to court if the allegations were actually true. With that said, women that Joe was able to, successfully convince or to seduce, I guess, Joe usually remains silent about them unless specific events required his public statements in order to assassinate their characters. We don't have any statement from Joe concerning Eliza Winters. It's a very complicated subject, and it's honestly ripe for speculation. But the other incident from the New York era of the church that we need to talk about comes from Joe's 1830 trials for glass looking. 1830 is also the year the city plat for Chicago was drawn up. A fun little tidbit there. This is from Joe's own history of the church. Quote, after a few more such attempts, the court was detained for a time in order that 2 young women, the daughters of Mr. Stowell, with whom I had at times kept company, might be sent for, in order, if possible, to elicit something from them which might be made a pretext against me. The young ladies arrived and were severally examined touching my character and conduct in general, but particularly as to my behavior towards them, both in public and private, when they both bore such testimony in my favor as left my enemies without a pretext on their account. End quote. Somebody apparently suspected Joe of being sexually involved with Stowell's daughters during the time that he lived with Josiah Stowell. They were called as witnesses, and apparently they denied everything because, of course, they're going to deny everything because their reputations were on the line just as much as Joe's reputation was. Now, I acknowledge there's nothing provable here, but honestly, even just the rumor that something was going on with the Stowell daughters is enough for me. Where there's smoke, there's fire, especially when it concerns Joe's sexual conduct. Episode 21. I want to take a minute to talk about this in a bit of an abstract here. Puritanical social structures during this Victorian era meant sometimes dire consequences for those who stepped outside the boundaries of cis, hetero, monogamous relationships. As is the case today, the rules applied differently to the proletariat as opposed to those individuals in the upper crust. Speaking broadly, It wasn't uncommon for wealthy men, especially if they were well-connected and socially powerful, to have plenty of sex outside their marriage, while their wives were expected to remain faithful to their unfaithful husbands. For those men who weren't in the wealthy and powerful elite class, the tendencies to step outside of monogamy were just as present, but were far more likely to be prosecuted for adultery. And when I say prosecuted, I mean actually prosecuted. As of 2020, adultery is still illegal in 19 out of 50 states. In Florida, it was technically illegal for unmarried folks to live together until 2016. Adultery laws being on the books, they don't mean much unless they're prosecuted. In the 19th century, adultery was a surprisingly common charge and resulted in imprisonment, in fines, in rare occasions, in castration, and even capital punishment. Although I will point out that those more extreme forms of punishment, they really only happened in colonial America before the Revolution and for a short time thereafter, and usually only in extreme cases, which doesn't excuse the conduct, it simply contextualizes the conduct. Now, laws only apply to those upon whom they are enforced, meaning laws are almost always weaponized against the most poor and marginalized in society. So let's talk about adultery laws and women, because by far the majority of people prosecuted for adultery in American history were women. The value of women, societally speaking, has largely centered around their sexuality. It's a system of purity that largely impacts only women even to this day, because female sex is viewed largely through commodification. As soon as a woman is, quote-unquote, seduced, which is such a loaded term, she's no longer valuable to the man that she's supposed to marry. In adultery cases, it benefits every person accused to lie about what happened. This trend is even more insidious when we consider assault and rape. And please take this as a content warning for the rest of today's show, right? We're going to navigate some pretty dark waters for the rest of the show here. But broadly speaking, when someone is raped, it's culturally viewed as if the perpetrator somehow defiled that person's purity, thereby nullifying her value in society. With female sex commodified, the man who takes that purity away has somehow devalued her, devalued their victim. When the survivor chooses to press charges or even to speak up, far more often their credibility is brought into question and the attack dogs are unleashed on her. This man is a stand-up member of polite society. He would never do such a thing. What were you wearing? You must have been asking for it. Why were you in that situation? Why did you allow yourself to get so drunk? And then the cycle of a survivor becoming the victim of character assassination continues, and society never evolves. When it's a matter of he said, she said, society says, we believe him, and she's a liar. She's a slut, trying to tarnish this good man's reputation. What we see today is merely the modern iteration of social structures which have existed for millennia. Adultery laws in America have largely served to protect wealthy men and to oppress women. They've also been heavily weaponized against racial and ethnic minorities, especially when a white woman is involved in the situation. Now, think what you will about the Me Too movement and the various evolutions of feminism working to change these social structures, but to ignore that these ills exist is to be willfully ignorant. And we wonder why sexual assault and rape is almost never reported and exceptionally rare to reach any criminal convictions. Understanding the commodification of female sexuality and purity doctrine and women being the gatekeepers of sex, whatever that means, and men apparently just having uncontrollable sexual appetites, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And women's reputations being tied to their sexual worth, those are concepts that we have to juggle as we consider aspects of Mormon polygamy. To complicate matters further, any system seeking to upset or to overthrow these cultural ills can be a very appealing social movement for people who take issue with the social structures and the marriage structures as they exist. There are ways to see a conceptual polygamist society or polyamorous society as progressive and egalitarian, making the proposition very appealing to people who reject those societal constructs of strict monogamy and punishments for stepping outside of those boundaries. As an idea, Joseph Smith's polygamy was an appealing option to people who were ready to move beyond the confines of puritanical relationships and gender structures. So let's keep that thought in a mental compartment for a moment while we discuss the way that the actual practice played itself out. Polygamy as an ideal is far from the real-world practices and consequences. The fact is, polygamy in practice ended up becoming a vicious patriarchal system that created a wake of heartbreak, abuse, rape, and death in its path. With the top-down, exclusively male structure of Mormon leadership, the abusive system that resulted was inevitable. And the prophet himself often preyed on orphan children or convinced their parents that godhood awaited should they give their teenage daughter to him to be his wife. In order to understand polygamy and all of its complexities, we need to understand that while simultaneously keeping in our mind the fact that polygamy was also appealing for a lot of people as an ideal who wanted to push against or even overthrow the structures of puritanical sexuality and gender roles. How do we deal with the fact that Joe raped teenage girls while still understanding that some of his other wives were the ones responsible for convincing those children that the abusive encounter was not only acceptable in the eyes of God, but was necessary for everybody's exaltation? Those concepts are very difficult for us to juggle in our minds, especially if we try to fit Mormon polygamy into convenient little mental boxes. But it's absolutely necessary in order to understand some of the nuances of today's discussion. Oh, and anybody concluding that, like most of these marriages, quote-unquote marriages, didn't include sex, or that libido wasn't a factor in the practice and in the hatching of the polygamy revelation, that person's a hack, and they should work to extricate their heads from their own anuses before they work on researching the topic of polygamy. So after, the New York era and moving to Kirtland in 1831, Joe met one of his future polygamous wives. And every time I say wives and marriage in all of this, when it comes to polygamy, take those terms with a grain of salt because they are very loaded as well. This was a girl named Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner. She was 12 years old at the time, and she remembers her magnetic attraction to Joseph Smith on their first meeting and the way that he stared at her. This is from Todd Compton's book, In Sacred Loneliness, page 207. Quote, Mary wrote, I was sent for. When he saw me, he looked at me so earnestly. I felt almost afraid, and I thought, he can read my every thought, and I thought how blue his eyes were. After a moment or two, he came and put his hands on my head and gave me a great blessing, the first I ever received, and made me a present of the book. And his countenance shone and seemed almost transparent. It seems as though the solemnity of eternity rested upon all of us. He seemed almost transfixed. He was looking ahead, and his face outshone the candle which was on the shelf just behind him. I thought I could almost see the cheekbones. He looked as though a searchlight was inside his face and shining through every pore. I could not take my eyes from his face. She regarded this as the first time she was, quote-unquote, sealed to the Mormon prophet, end quote. What Mary Elizabeth Rollins' accounts do for historians is to document a trend in Joe's sexual practices. The guy carried clout wherever he went because his reputation preceded him for both good and evil. Wherever he went, people expected to meet a man pious and worthy of the office that he claimed, the mouthpiece of the Almighty God. This has an incredible ability to break down barriers and to create expectations in the person's mind. It's a master manipulation tactic, and Mary Rollins was yet another victim of Joe's predatory practices. From the time they first met, Mary held a certain reverence and affinity for the prophet, and it seems he was drawn to her in her early pubescent phase. As she matured into womanhood, Joseph would seem to never take his eyes off of her, which is how predators operate. Joseph would later tell Mary that he was commanded in 1834, when she was 15 years old, to take her as his wife. But he couldn't do it because she was living in Missouri, 1,000 miles away from Kirtland, after obeying Joe's revelation for the Mormons to settle there in Missouri. She soon married a young man named Adam Leitner, a non-Mormon from Pennsylvania, and Mary continued to keep the idea of being married to the prophet in her mind, and finally in early 1842 he would propose to take her as his polygamous wife, which she agreed to while living with her non-Mormon husband, who apparently thought very highly of Joe, but couldn't believe in the church. A unique situation indeed. The church started to experience its first major apostasy in late 1831 with the defections of Ezra Booth and Simmons Ryder, among other people. Ezra Booth wrote an expose of Mormonism in the form of a series of newspaper articles, and Simmons Ryder participated in a mob that covered Joe and Sidney Rigdon in tar and feathers in 1832. We'll talk about that in just a few minutes here, but also, if it's of interest, you can listen to the Ezra Booth letters on the Patreon exclusive feed when we read through Mormonism Unveiled with my commentary. Now, the tar and feathers incident is interesting because the mob's motives aren't totally clear. Apparently, Simmons Ryder believed that Joe and Rigdon were attempting a land grab in the Kirtland area, and he stirred up the mob partly on that basis. But according to a Church of Christ member named Clark Braden, who interviewed a bunch of people in the 1880s, the mob also had another motivation. Braden says, quote, "The mob was led by Eli Johnson, who blamed Smith for being too intimate with his sister Miranda, who afterwards married Orson Hyde. Brigham Young in after years twitted Hyde with this fact, and Hyde, on learning its truth, put away his wife, although they had several children," end quote. Now, there are definite problems with this account from the 1880s. It's a pretty late source. We don't know who Braden got this information from. Also, Eli Johnson was Miranda's uncle, not her brother. However, there are a couple pieces of circumstantial evidence that do support some details in this account. For one thing, Miranda was living in the same house as Joe at the time. We know Joe's patterns of predation often involved with women with whom he lived. For another thing, we know that Joe was interested in Miranda because he later married her as a plural wife in Nauvoo. She was 15 or 16 at this time in 1832. And finally, we know from an account written by Apostle Luke Johnson that the mob tried to castrate Joe and even brought a doctor to perform the deed who ended up losing his nerve before actually castrating the prophet. Why would they cut his testicles off? Unless their motivation had something to do with sex. And of course, at the time, Emma and Joe had just lost their twins, and they had adopted the Murdoch twins, who were less than a year old at this point. 1832 also happens to be the year that Orson Pratt pointed to as the time when Joe told certain individuals that, quote, "the principle of taking more wives than one is a true principle, but the time had not yet come for it to be practiced," end quote. Mosiah Hancock dates that doctrine to 1832 as well. He says that Joe approached his father, Levi Hancock, in spring of 1832 and said, quote, "Brother Levi, the Lord has revealed to me that it is his will that righteous men shall take righteous women, even a plurality of wives, that a righteous race may be sent forth upon the earth," end quote. The very few documents which exist about this they're late, and they come from members of the Salt Lake City Church. But what historians generally believe is that these statements are in reference to the Native American missions, a righteous race of Mormons with multiple native wives to raise up a white and delightsome race of righteous people, righteous men with a plurality of righteous wives. Now, rumors about something like Mormon polygamy circulated in 1831 and 1832. The evangelical magazine and Gospel Advocate reported in their February 5th, 1831 issue, quote, "They, the Mormons, have all things in common and dispense with the marriage covenant," end quote. Henry Carroll, who was in the Kirtland area in 1832, recalled in 1885, quote, "It was claimed all things were common, even to free love among the Mormons at Kirtland," end quote. Now, let's put this on hold and take this opportunity to discuss the concept of free love groups. The Cochranites. They're often talked about in Mormon history circles, but the Cochranites predated Mormonism, and they were into some kind of form of free love. The Oneida group would follow the next decade of being openly polyamorous, and all members of the Oneida group were all married to each other. Free love was an appealing concept, albeit controversial. A lot of people wanted to explore what love looked like outside the strict confines of hetero-monogamous marriages. With so many accusations of polygamy invading early Mormonism, surely some converted just to learn about how true those rumors were, or even have the possibility of having open relationships. This early Kirtland church was an era of experimentation. However, that experimentation can only go so far before some hard lessons are learned and the church evolved into what it needed to become in order to be competitive against other churches. Those other free love sects, they never had more than a few hundred adherents because the beliefs were so counterculture and they're so fringe. If you want your religion to grow in a puritanical world, you have to remain on the very edge of controversy to be distinct, but not so controversial as to be relegated to the fringe like these other free love groups. Joe recognized that an openly free love religion would be too hard for a lot of people to swallow and would never have the numbers necessary for his Mormon revolution of the world to build Zion, the New Jerusalem. You can either be a free love sect on the fringes or a more mainstream sect with thousands of followers. You can't have both. What Kirtland reveals to us is a few signals that Joe wanted to take the early church towards free love, but once he realized he wanted to continue to expand the religion and stay out of the fringes of society, an openly polygamous sect obviously wouldn't be possible. But then, that doesn't work really well for Joe because he wants to have his cake and eat it too, so the only possible way to satiate his sex drive was to create inner circles of leadership who could practice polygamy while keeping the doctrine away from the lay membership. This created a tension. So how does Joe make sure to keep the practice as nothing more than shadows and rumors about the elite while leveraging those rumors to bring initiates into the polygamous fold? How does he ensure compliance and silence to keep his church from becoming a fringe free love sect? Many of Joe's hierarchical evolutions can be explained by his greed, be that greed for wealth or for possessing more women in a very exclusive group of the leadership. Continuing on in the early Kirtland era, W.W. Phelps, Double Dub Phelps, William Wines Phelps, first heard about polygamy in 1834 when he asked Joe about a revelation that Joe had received just 3 years earlier in 1831. The actual text of this revelation didn't survive, but we know from several descriptions of it roughly what it said. The occasion was that the U.S. government had expelled the church's first missionaries to the Native Americans in Indian Territory and had denied them missionary permits to preach there. The revelation authorized the missionaries to marry native women so that they could enter the Indian Territory with the 19th century equivalent of a spousal visa, of a green card, basically. According to Double Dub Phelps, quote, "About 3 years after this was given, I asked Brother Joseph Smith privately how we that were mentioned in the revelation could take wives from the natives, as we were all married men. He replied instantly, in the same manner that Abraham took Hagar and Keturah, and Jacob took Rachel, Bilhah, and Zilpah, by revelation. The saints of the Lord are always directed by revelation." End quote. And this marks the first time that Joe cited examples of biblical polygamy as justification for taking multiple wives, be they natives or just, the wives and women within the leadership. Benjamin Johnson says that he heard about plural marriage in 1835. Here's an excerpt from his autobiography. Quote, "In 1835 at Kirtland, I learned from my sister's husband, Lyman R. Sherman, who was close to the prophet and received it from him, that the ancient order of plural marriage was again to be practiced by the church. After this, there was some trouble with Jared Carter, and through Brother Sherman I learned that as he had built himself a new house, he now wanted another wife, which Joseph would not permit." End quote. And then, the following year, Joe got into his most famous sex scandal, the Fanny Alger affair. Born in 1816 in Massachusetts to Samuel Alger and Clarissa Hancock, Fanny Alger moved into the Smith home in 1832 as a domestic servant. According to Annalisa Webb Young, Emma was very fond of Fanny and treated her like an adopted daughter. So, quote, "It was with a shocked surprise that the people heard that Sister Emma had turned Fanny out of the house in spring of 1836. By degrees, it became whispered about that Joseph's love for his adopted daughter was by no means a paternal affection, and his wife, discovering the fact, at once took measures to put the girl beyond his reach." End quote. According to Apostle William McClellan, Professor Bill, as we called him many, many moons ago, Emma later explained to him how she found out. Noticing that Joe and Fanny were missing, she went looking for them. Quote, "She went to the barn and saw him and Fanny in the barn together alone. She looked through the crack and saw the transaction. She told me this story too was verily true." End quote. Emma's comments confirmed what McClellan had earlier heard from Oliver Cowdery. Now, some scholars think that Joe and Fanny began the affair as early as 1832, but obviously there's no way to prove that. She would have been 14 years old at the time. We don't know, right? And that's the case with most of these relationships. Most historians think that it started about 1835 when Benjamin Johnson says that he first heard rumors that Joe loved Fanny. Obviously, Emma learned about this in the spring of 1836 when she caught them in the barn together, and then she kicked Fanny out. Fanny ended up being kicked not only out of the Smith home, but completely out of Kirtland. She got kicked out of town. Annalisa Webb Young says that Emma was so mad at Joe that Joe had to call upon Oliver Cowdery to mediate between them. Ollie was livid about the affair, and it eventually caused him to apostatize from the church. Ollie spread rumors about this affair to some other people, and then Joe called Ollie a liar and had him brought up on disciplinary charges. On January 21st, 1838, Ollie wrote a letter to his brother Warren A. Cowdery to clarify that, quote, "I never confessed, intimated, or admitted that I ever willfully lied about Joseph. When he was here, we had some conversation in which every instance I did not fail to affirm that what I said was strictly true. A dirty, nasty, filthy scrape," which was later changed to affair, "a dirty, nasty, filthy affair of his and Fanny Alger's was talked over, in which I strictly declared that I had never deviated from the truth on the matter, and as I supposed was admitted by himself." End quote. Ollie obviously viewed this whole thing as just an extramarital affair, but there's some debate about whether it was an extramarital affair or whether it was early plural marriage. In the book Persistence of Polygamy, friend of the show Don Bradley argues pretty persuasively that there was, in fact, some kind of a marriage ceremony here. Mosiah Hancock claims that Joe came to his father, Levi Hancock, and said this, quote, "Brother Levi, I want to make a bargain with you. If you will get Fanny Alger for me for a wife, you may have Clarissa Reed. I love Fanny." "I will," said father. "Go, brother Levi, and let the Lord will prosper you," said Joseph. Father goes to the father Samuel Alger, father's brother-in-law, and said, "Samuel, the prophet Joseph loves your daughter Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you?" Uncle Sam says, "Go and talk with the old woman about it. 'Twill be as she says." Father goes to his sister and said, "Clarissa, brother Joseph, the prophet of the Most High God, loves Fanny and wishes her for a wife. What say you?" Said she, "Go and talk to Fanny. It will be all right with me." Father goes to Fanny and says, "Fanny, brother Joseph the prophet loves you and wishes you for a wife. Will you be his wife?" "I will, Levi," she said. Father takes Fanny to Joseph and said, "Brother Joseph, I have been successful in my mission." Father gave her to Joseph, repeating the ceremony as Joseph repeated to him. End quote. This account is definitely consistent with how Joe usually went about proposing to women by using male intermediaries. This is a development of his patterns of serial polygamy, serial abuse, serial acquisition of wives outside of the boundaries of puritanical monogamous relationships. But some historians reject this account because it's really late. It's a secondhand source from somebody connected with the Brighamite polygamous church when it was given. But that said, I really don't think that it matters much whether there was a marriage ceremony or not, because regardless, Joe lied about it to Emma. This relationship was concealed from Emma and everybody else, and the discovery of it catalyzed a major rift in the Kirtland and Missouri churches, causing numerous excommunications and eventually the prophet's own exile from Ohio, which says nothing of Fanny's own experience. We don't know exactly what the relationship was like or what the actual dynamics, the power dynamics of that relationship looked like. We just don't know. There really isn't much about it that we can latch onto. The incident of discovering the affair, it was really instructive to Joe. His people would reject anything smacking of non-monogamy. Just a year before, the church had voted to canonize what later became D&C 101, which was moved in the late 1870s because it openly denies that polygamy was happening, and it claims that all of the rumors about it are false, and it says that Mormonism is a strictly monogamous religion. We're going to talk about that later in the episode. Even if he himself was to practice polygamy, Joe learned that he'd need to be very guarded about who would be admitted into the holiest of holy marriage doctrines. And according to the rest of Messiah Hancock's account, some dissenters ended up locking Fanny in an upper room of the temple, intending to trot her out to testify to the High Council about Joe's adultery. I'm sure that was really great for Fanny. I'm sure she loved every minute of that. Joe then went to Fanny's father, Samuel Alger, and asked him to do something to prevent this, and apparently Alger climbed up a second-story window and helped his daughter down, and then the Alger family rode away to Indiana under the cover of night, where Fanny married a guy named Solomon Custer 2 months later, perhaps to provide cover for a pregnancy that she had. Now, having people skip town in order to avoid having to testify against him, that was pretty common for Joe, especially when he controlled the Nauvoo court system. But if Fanny was pregnant, then unfortunately we don't know what happened to the baby because there's almost no documentation of her life after 1837. Episode 33. Another allegation against Joe from the Kirtland period concerns Nancy Rigdon. Joe famously later proposed to Nancy in Nauvoo when she was 19 years old and gave her what's known as the happiness letter, which we'll discuss in a little while. But a few sources date Joe's first interest in Nancy to the tail end of the Kirtland period when she was like 15 or 16 years old. William C. Smith, who went to school with Nancy's sister, Athalia, in Kirtland, thought he remembered some talk at school about Joe and Sidney Rigdon fighting because Joe wanted to marry Nancy. But he wasn't positive that he remembered this correctly. Clark Braden, who interviewed some old residents of Kirtland in the 1880s, reported the same thing but also didn't name his source. The best piece of evidence we have for this is a September 1837 letter published by Ollie's brother, Warren Cowdery. Warren had heard that rumors were afloat in nearby towns which claimed that Joe and Sidney Rigdon had a falling out. Warren doesn't say specifically what the rumors were related to, but he refutes them by saying that the females of Rigdon's family are, quote, young, innocent, unsuspecting, without reproach, and for aught we know, above suspicion, end quote. The rumors were afloat in 1837, but what these rumors actually were is a subject of speculation. We also know that Joe targeted a number of teenage girls during the Kirtland era who he would later convince to give in to his desires to submit, that he would seduce them in Nauvoo, and Nancy Rigdon fits those patterns perfectly. Eventually, the Kirtland Safety Society was started, and murmurings blew completely out of control. I know I mentioned this Mormon bank a lot on the show, but it's a really important time because it marks a turning point in church practices from ecclesiastical to overtly corporate. After its collapse and the dissenting groups formed at Kirtland, Joe and the Quorum of Apostles fled to Missouri under the cover of night. This resulted in the Missouri-Mormon War of 1838, and Joe waxed militant, episodes 39 through 49. The Mormons surrendered, and Joe was taken with his buddies to Liberty Jail, episode 50. While Joe was in Liberty Jail, the Mormon exodus from Missouri to Illinois commenced, and he attempted to retain control over his followers from his prison cell via messengers carrying personal letters. Many of these letters were about affairs concerning the church and directing minutiae of the exodus. However, some personal letters from the prophet also made their way to various people. The first one was a letter to Emma. He wrote it in reply to a very beautiful letter that she had sent him, in which she expressed her love for him and her absolute anguish for what he was going through in Liberty Jail. He wrote back, expressing sympathy for her troubles as well, and promising that, quote, if God will spare my life once more to have the privilege of taking care of you, I will ease your care and endeavor to comfort your heart. He went on to say, my dear Emma, do you think that my being cast into prison by the mob renders me less worthy of your friendship? No, I do not think so, end quote. Now, wait a second. What's this about friendship? Maybe I'm reading too much into this, but it took 2 weeks for Joe to reply to Emma's heartfelt letter, and instead of love, he expresses his friendship? Meanwhile, during that period that he sat on Emma's letter, apparently he was too busy sitting in a jail cell to get around to replying to it. He also wrote a letter to Norman Buell's wife, Presendia Huntington Buell. The Buells had visited him in prison, and Joe wrote this letter to thank them for the visit. Quote, I want him and you to know that I am your true friend. I was glad to see you. No tongue can tell what inexpressible joy it gives a man to see the face of one who has been a friend after having been enclosed in the walls of a prison for 5 months. It seems to me that my heart will always be more tender after this than ever it was before." End quote. Okay, so Joe calls Presyndia a friend, too, so no big deal. Except her husband was reading this letter too, so obviously he had to be discreet. Presyndia would become one of Joe's wives in December of 1841, just 2 years after this. Now keep in mind, as we discussed last episode, Joe had just recently taken his first actual polyandrous plural wife, Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris, in Missouri in 1838, just barely a year before he wrote this letter. And polyandrous meaning that, Lucinda already had a husband when Joe married her. So when Joe wrote this letter to Presyndia, he was already in the mindset that a prior husband wasn't necessarily a deal breaker. Notably, Lucinda, the widow of William Morgan, who wrote the expose on Masonry and disappeared, was one of Joe's wives who took his death particularly hard. But that's going to have to wait until the end of this series before we talk about her again. Now, the Bros eventually escaped from prison. They made their way to the Mormon refugee settlement in Quincy, Illinois. Soon after, they began settling Commerce, which eventually was incorporated to become Nauvoo once the Nauvoo Charter was passed, episode 66. Each era of Mormonism preceding Nauvoo relies on a lot of speculation and fragmentary evidence when it comes to polygamy. From the New York era, we have, a legal complaint, a couple of court hearings, and some later interviews from the 1870s and 80s which allude to some sexual experimentation. In Kirtland, the evidence expands a bit, but really we only have one solid name, Fanny Alger. In Missouri, the evidence surrounding Lucinda Pendleton Morgan Harris is pretty significant and very trustable, but she's really the only name that we have for the Missouri era. Nauvoo is it's a totally different ballgame. The evidence for polygamy grows from a few fragmentary claims to mountains of journals and affidavits and structural changes in the church, documented sealings, the polygamy revelation itself, and so much more. Anybody claiming that Joe didn't practice polygamy, or even more asinine claims that he fought polygamy, they're just willfully ignorant. Episode 190. I'll also point out another stunning claim from the recently published anthology of Mormon historians. It's titled Writing Mormon History, edited by a friend of the show, Joseph Geisner. A Mormon apologist named Brian Hales wrote his chapter, and I want to deal with a passage from that book on page 109, where Brian is recounting his time doing the research for his volumes, Joseph Smith's Polygamy. He hired friend of the show, Don Bradley, to help do some research, and they had a conversation. From Writing Mormon History, page 108, quote, "Don had given me some information regarding Fanny Alger, whom Joseph Smith had reportedly married in the mid-1830s in Ohio, and I asked him whether anyone had accused Smith of polygamy prior to John C. Bennett in 1842. Bennett had left the church in 42, and before the end of the year had written a book attacking Smith and the Latter-day Saints. Writers such as Fawn Brody and Gerald and Sandra Tanner had asserted that throughout the 1830s, Smith was deflecting polygamy allegations. Don and I both paused and pondered for a few seconds. We then realized that our research didn't support this. It seemed that no one had accused Smith using that specific word or anything similar implying plurality of wives throughout that decade or in connection with Fanny Alger. I asked Don to search for any contemporaneous charges of polygamy, which both he and I were never able to find in the historical record." End quote. Nobody charged Joseph Smith with polygamy until Reckitt Bennett in 1842? Brian Hales is a very careful apologist. He never writes something easily proved wrong, would he? Well, why don't we take a look at Doctrine and Covenants section 101 that was printed in 1835, the same year that the Fanny Alger affair was happening. Quote, "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, when either is at liberty to marry again." End quote. Not only had numerous newspaper articles been written, and Ezra Booth had claimed polygamy was going on in his 1831 letters, But the rumors and charges were so rampant against the church that an entire section of the Doctrine and Covenants was dedicated to responding to those charges. Simply put, I can't imagine any amount of tortured language or semantic arguments of polygamy versus spiritual wifery versus adultery versus fornication or any other words associated where Brian's assertion in writing Mormon history is true. But unfortunately for him and other apologists who study polygamy, they have to fit the practice into a comfortable little box that makes Joseph Smith a wonderful, pious man who never harmed a fly. They create false distinctions between spiritual wifery and celestial marriage, which was a distinction that was invented by Joe to assassinate John C. Reckitt Bennett, his character anyway, when the practices were they functioned exactly the same. The apologist claims that there is a difference between time versus time in eternity and eternity-only sealings, with sex being that contingent factor. In arguments made by the church's own gospel topics essay about polygamy makes the same distinction. The apologist has to see Joseph Smith as a holy man who would never commit adultery unless God commanded him to practice the new and everlasting covenant. But the apologist is placing their own value judgments on a maniacal serial criminal from 185 years ago, and it's sophistry. That's all this is. It's factoring out evidence that conflicts with our modern sense of Mormon sexual purity, and it's a matter of torturing that evidence to be what you want instead of simply going where that evidence leads. I hate intellectual dishonesty, especially when the apologist is this brazen and unapologetic. Religion poisons everything. And that leads us into a discussion about this controversial figure in Nauvoo Mormon history. In August 1840, Joe received a letter from John C. Reckitt Bennett informing him that Bennett had, quote, come to the conclusion to join your people immediately and take up my abode with you, end quote. A brigadier general and eventually quartermaster general of the Illinois militia, Bennett laced his letter with a bunch of militant language, quote, let us adopt the means to end, and the victory is ours. The winged warrior of the air will not cease to be our proud emblem of liberty, and the dogs of war will be forever chained, end quote. Bennett showed up in Commerce the next month and was baptized into the church, and Joe quickly recognized Bennett as a talented, kindred scoundrel, episode 115, and put Bennett to work drafting the Nauvoo Charter. Bennett soon became a key leader of the church and of the Nauvoo Legion and the city government as mayor of Nauvoo. John C. Bennett was a grade A all-American bastard, which is why he and Joe got along so well. 2 months after his baptism, Bennett gave his first sermon to the church at General Conference. Among other things, he, quote, remarked that it was necessary for the brethren to stand by each other and resist every unlawful attempt at persecution, end quote. Bennett was an opportunist, and he knew what he needed to say to gain the sympathies and the support of his audience. Bennett also, quote, said that many persons had been accused of crime and had been looked upon as guilty when on investigation it has been ascertained that nothing could be adduced against them, whereupon on motion it was resolved that no person be considered guilty of crime unless proved so by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, end quote. Now, obviously, he sold this to the church under the pretense of preventing persecution, but the real effect was to lay the groundwork for polygamy. Now, nobody could come after Joe in a church court for adultery unless 2 or 3 witnesses had seen him do the deed. Now, anybody caught in the act of adultery would need to have a friend or 2 by their side when they caught the adulterous occurrence happening in order for the evidence to be considered valid in the Nauvoo City Court. It eventually became a common refrain that if nobody knows about this relationship but the 2 engaging in polygamy or spiritual wifery, they were functionally the same, then there is no crime in it. Which translates to, if you don't tell anybody about me raping you, then we're not going to have any problems, right? In April of 1841, the same month that the first European-American wagon train left Missouri to actually settle in California, We have the first indisputable documentation of Joe taking his first Nauvoo polygamous wife, Louisa Beeman. Louisa was the daughter of one of Joe's old treasure-digging friends, Alva Beeman. She was 26 when she married him, and he was 35. According to page 59 of Todd Compton's book In Sacred Loneliness, Joe approached Louisa's brother-in-law, Joseph Bates Noble, in fall of 1840, and, quote, taught him the principle of celestial or plural marriage, or a plurality of wives, spiritual wifery, saying that an angel had given him a revelation on the subject, and that the angel of the Lord had commanded Smith to move forward in the said order of marriage. Smith then asked Noble to officiate in marrying Louisa to himself. The prophet said, in revealing this to you, I have placed my life in your hands. Therefore, do not in an evil hour betray me to my enemies. End quote. A quick way to gain a person's confidence is to be vulnerable, and this was Joe's M.O. in nearly every plural marriage like this. Now, we don't know how Noble's conversation with Louisa went, but according to family tradition, she prayed about the proposal, and then she received some kind of a spiritual witness. And she was married to Joe on April 5th, 1841, with Joseph Bates Noble performing the ceremony for them. And Noble believed that this was, quote, the first sealing ceremony in this dispensation, end quote, which certainly functions as a great answer to modern apologists who claim that the sealing power existed all the way back in Kirtland before the whole Fanny Alger scrape. It was performed, quote, under an elm tree in Nauvoo, the bride disguised in a coat and hat, end quote. Most other Nauvoo plural marriages were performed in the red brick store, but that was still under construction when Joe married Louisa. Thus, the need for a disguise, make her look like a man, to maintain the secrecy of this outdoor wedding away from prying eyes within any of the few overcrowded buildings in the burgeoning city of Nauvoo. According to testimony that Noble gave in court after the marriage ceremony, Joe and Louisa went right across the river after the ceremony to Joseph Noble's house, where they slept together and consummated their relationship. Noble saw them in bed together, and Joe afterwards told him that the couple had consummated the marriage explicitly. But no, of course, no, polygamy is never about sex. It's about God ushering in the new dispensation, and the participants, especially the pious prophet himself, they only begrudgingly acceded to the practice after being chastised by angels with flaming swords and stuff. It's ridiculous. Not long after this marriage to Louisa Beeman, Joe also married Zina Diantha Huntington in the summer of 1841. Originally from New York, Zina had converted to Mormonism at age 14 in 1835 and eventually became a bit of a celebrity in Utah Mormonism. She frequently sang in tongues and exercised the gifts of healing and prophecy. Her mother, Zina Baker Huntington, even briefly raised someone from the dead, apparently. Zina was a compassionate and a wonderful person, traits which would eventually elevate her to elite status in Utah and usher her into the position of third president of the General Relief Society. When she met Joe at age 15, he was 30, she found his features striking. Quote, he was 6 feet, light auburn hair and a heavy nose, blue eyes, the eyeballs full and round and rather long, end quote. In 1839, Zina's mother died, and the Huntington teenagers moved in with the Smiths. As he often did with wards who lived in his house, Joe took that opportunity to start courting Zina as a to-be potential plural wife. As usual, he used a male intermediary, her brother Dimmick B. Huntington. Dimmick taught his sister about polygamy, and then, according to a biography by one of Zina's grandkids, quote, Joseph pressed Zina for an answer to his marriage proposal on at least 3 occasions in 1840, but she avoided answering him, end quote. Instead, she married a young man named Henry Jacobs on March 7th, 1841. Zina and Henry asked Joe to perform their marriage ceremony, but Joe didn't show up. He ghosted him. In O.A. Cannon's biography of Zina, we read, quote, when the couple arrived, the prophet was not there. After a wait, they decided to ask the clerk, John C. Bennett, if he would perform the marriage, which he did. When the couple later met the prophet, Zina asked him why he hadn't come as he had promised. He told her it had been made known to him that she was to be his celestial wife, and he could not give to another one who had been given to him, end quote. If there was ever something for Joe to be petty about. You know it has to be a woman that he wanted, but refused his advances 3 times. This jealous reaction caused Zina to reconsider her rejection of Smith's proposals. By her own account, she searched the scriptures prayerfully and obtained a testimony of the doctrine of plural marriage. Henry Jacobs accepted the doctrine as well, although it reportedly broke his heart. On October 27th, about 6 months pregnant with her first child, 20-year-old Zina became Joe's polyandrous wife with Henry's full approval. Zina later wrote, quote, "I made a greater sacrifice than to give my life, for I never anticipated again to be looked upon as an honorable woman by those I dearly loved." End quote. So much that goes into this. That's what happens when people's social worth is attached to their sexuality. It's purity doctrine. And according to George D. Smith's book, Nauvoo Polygamy, quote, Henry and Zina's first child, Zebulon, was born on January 2nd, 1842. 2 weeks later, Smith sent Jacobs on a mission to Chicago, from which he returned the following March, end quote. So not only did Joe marry Henry's pregnant wife, but then he also sent Henry off on a mission, even though he had a newborn son. And I'm sure Zina, as a 20-year-old new mother, was well cared for during her husband's mission. I'm sure her life was great. Over the next few years, Henry served 2 more missions as well. After Joe's death, Bloody Brigham Young ended up marrying Zina as a plural wife, and Henry obediently married somebody else in 1846. Why did Zina and Henry agree to this arrangement? Why did any of these people agree to be manipulated like this? Religions, especially religious cults, poison everything. In late 1841 and early 1842, Joe targeted several more women. First, let's cover Mary Elizabeth Rollins Lightner, the girl whom Joe had first noticed when she was 12 years old in Kirtland, to whom he gifted a Book of Mormon. According to Mary's own account, Joe proposed to her in early February 1842. After introducing the idea of plural marriage, he told her that God had instructed him to marry her in 1834, but of course he had been in Kirtland and she was in Missouri. And he had been frightened of the idea, but an angel had appeared to him 3 times in 8 years, quote, and said I was to obey that principle or he would slay me, end quote. He also told her that she, quote, was created for him before the foundation of the earth was laid, and that God had authorized him to guarantee salvation for all of his wives. Like, that alone reveals the trouble with Joe's system. Look, I'm all for everybody loving and playing with anybody they want, as long as they're consenting adults with equal power dynamics. These targets believed that Joe was the mouthpiece of God. Anything that he said was divine law and commandment from God. In basically every case of polygamy, Joe leveraged that power stemming from people's credulity to accomplish rape. When somebody tells you that God commands you to submit to whatever they're going to do to you, you're being manipulated to serve selfish desires. The proposal was a shock to Mary, and at first she didn't agree to the marriage and asked him if it actually might have been a devil rather than an angel that had appeared to him. That's a reasonable first instinct, right? For a young girl growing up in a puritanical Christian society and practicing a religion that is unquestionably monogamous, to be approached by the prophet of God with such a proposal understandably caused some conflicts inside of her mind. He assured her that it was an angel that told her to pray about it and that she would receive a witness if she did. At the end of the conversation, he asked her if she would turn traitor and speak of this to anyone. She replied, I shall never tell a mortal I had such a talk from a married man. Mary did pray about this, and a few nights later, an angel appeared to her in her bedroom, and her aunt actually woke up and saw, quote, a figure in white robes, and, quote, go out the window. So apparently the angel was an actor and not a hallucination. After this vision, as she interpreted it, Mary agreed to marry Joe, and he finally collected his prize at the end of February 1842. And even calling these situations marriages is a really troublesome concept when we consider all of the factors that played into each of these relationships. And even relationship is a hard way to describe it, but I digress. Let's next talk about Martha Brotherton, because her story illustrates how much polygamy permeated the top echelons of Mormon leadership. Brigham Young and Heber Kimball were some of Joe's greatest allies and wingmen when it came to acquiring more wives, and Joseph was happy to return the favor, as he did for Brigham Young with Martha Brotherton. Brigham had converted the Brotherton family during his mission in Europe, and they immigrated to Nauvoo. Their 17-year-old daughter, Martha, caught Brigham's eye. Here's how they ambushed her, from H. Michael Marquardt's The Rise of Mormonism, quote, "Going upstairs with Heber C. Kimball to the second floor of the red brick store, she, Martha, found Brigham Young and Joseph Smith alone. Martha was introduced to the prophet Joseph Smith by Brigham Young. Joseph offered Martha his seat, after which Smith and Heber Kimball left the room, leaving Martha alone with Apostle Young. Brigham Young arose, locked the door, closed the window, and drew the curtain. He then came and sat before Martha Brotherton," end quote. Brigham then explained to her the doctrine of polygamy, that if she were, quote, "willing to take up the cross of being married to him as a plural wife that very day, then he could take her straight to the celestial kingdom," end quote. Lucky her, am I right? So lucky for Martha Brotherton. Well, she explained that she wasn't of legal age and she didn't want to be married without her parents' permission. He urged her to make her own decision without consulting her parents, quote, "For I know it to be right before God, and if there is any sin in it, I will answer for it," end quote. Oh, that's so generous of Brigham Young to take on God's wrath on behalf of Martha Brotherton. Well, she told him that she wanted some time to think about it, and at this point, he kissed her, and then Joe came back into the room. Joe said to her, quote, "Well, Martha, it is lawful and right before God. I know it is. Look here, don't you believe in me? Well, Martha, just go ahead and do as Brigham wants you to. He is the best man in the world except me. Yes, I know that this is lawful and right before God, and if there is any sin in it, I will answer for it before God," end quote. Even Joe was willing to take on the wrath of God on behalf of Martha and Bloody Brigham. Well, Martha again said that she wanted some time to think about it, and then Joe and Bloody Brigham weren't taking that for an answer, and they continued to pressure her. Every time she asked for some time to think, and they got more and more defensive about it. And finally, Joe told her that she could have some time if she would promise not to tell anyone what happened. And then she agreed to it. Ultimately, she refused the proposal. When she went public with her story, the church smeared her as a prostitute, and her own sisters published letters accusing her of being a liar. Luckily, she did have an advocate in the form of John C. Reckitt Bennett, who was in the process of collecting data for his forthcoming expose of Joe Smith in the church, and Bennett printed her story in his book, published near the end of 1842. And of course, supporters of the show can listen to that entire audiobook, History of the Saints, with my commentary on the Patreon exclusive feed. Next, let's talk about Nancy Rigdon. As I already mentioned, there were a few rumors that connected Joe with Nancy all the way back in the Curland period. That makes her another girl that he sexually groomed from childhood, just like Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner and a few others. When he proposed to Nancy in Nauvoo in early 1842, she was 19, and he was nearly twice her age at age 36. Now, he would have first met Nancy when she was only 8 years old. Jessie Rigdon Seckard said she was, quote, "more than good-looking, she was as beautiful as a Greek statue," end quote. Rather than approach Nancy directly, Joe offered John C. Bennett either $500 or the best lot on Main Street if he succeeded in getting Nancy to marry Joe. Bennett declined because he and Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon were friends, and out of concern for Nancy's innocence, of course, he said no. Joe retorted that her innocence would remain intact because God had authorized the marriage, but Bennett still declined. So instead, Joe sent Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde. Now, Marinda was Orson Hyde's wife, but we discussed that on the last episode. We also discussed that a little bit earlier. Joe had married her in December of 1841, while Orson Hyde was away on a mission to Israel, Orson L'Chaidim. Now, according to Ebenezer Robinson, John C. Bennett and Sidney Rigdon, Marinda also had a sexual relationship with Whiteout Willard Richards around this time. Now, she and Richards moved into the printing office together after she was sealed to Joseph Smith. Now, Joe had given Marinda a revelation commanding her to hearken unto his counsel in all things. And that's what she did. Among other things, she helped him to recruit new plural wives, including Nancy Rigdon. She approached Nancy at a funeral. At a funeral! She approached Nancy and invited her to come meet privately with Joseph Smith in the printing office. Prior to the meeting, she mentioned this strange request to her boyfriend, Francis Higbee, who then mentioned it to John C. Bennett, who warned Higbee that, what Joe's intentions were. So Nancy went to the meeting, but she went forewarned by her boyfriend, and her guard was up for the encounter. And according to Bennett, when Nancy got there, Joe locked the door, swore Nancy to secrecy, and then told her that he loved her and that she had been, quote, the idol of his affections, end quote, for several years, and he proposed a marriage. Nancy apparently wasn't amused. She said that, quote, if she ever got married, she would marry a single man or none at all, end quote. And she felt threatened, and she was going to scream and alert the neighbors unless Joe immediately opened the door and let her out, which he eventually did. Joe and Miranda tried to reason with Nancy a little bit more, but she stormed away. Episode 117. In an attempt to salvage the situation, Joe dictated a letter to Nancy known as the Letter on Happiness, colloquially referred to as the Happiness Letter today. Willard Richards delivered the letter and told Nancy to burn it after reading. We need to spend some time on this letter. Friends of the show, Jonathan Streeter, Christopher Smith, and Bill Reel did a 2.5-hour broadcast on the Happiness Letter on the Thinker of Thoughts YouTube channel, so I'm going to recommend that as a resource. It's like 2.5 hours long, but it's a really solid resource, and they really go through it and put it within the context of religious persuasion and cult leaders. We're going to do our best to navigate the letter briefly here on this episode. The Happiness Letter is a masterclass of religious coercion, moral relativism, and alternations between the words of God as commandments and as permissions. It begins, quote, happiness is the object and design of our existence and will be the end thereof if we pursue the path that leads to it. And this path is virtue, uprightness, faithfulness, holiness, and keeping all the commandments of God. But we cannot keep all the commandments without first knowing them, and we cannot expect to know all or more than we now know unless we comply with or keep those we have already received. Now, the manipulation is established in the first paragraph here. Joe knows the only way to true salvation and thereby to true happiness. But we can't keep all the commandments if we don't know them, so Joe is simply trying to help Nancy achieve happiness by proposing this new and everlasting covenant, this commandment of polygamy. Joe is doing her the favor. He's doing it for her sake, and she should consider herself lucky to be a candidate for true happiness that Joe is about to teach her. It continues. That which is wrong under one circumstance may be and often is right under another. God said, thou shalt not kill. At another time, he said, thou shalt utterly destroy. This is the principle on which the government of heaven is conducted, by revelation, adapted to the circumstances in which the children of the kingdom are placed. Here, Joe jumps into the viewpoint of whatever God commands is good, even if we feel like it isn't right. And the implication is, if God commands us to do something we don't feel right about, it's a failing on our part because we don't fully understand the circumstances, which makes that permissible or a commandment, explicitly a commandment. This is a dodge of the old Euthyphro paradox. Is murder wrong because God doesn't like it, or does God not like murder because it's wrong? It's an argument from moral relativism by divine decree, and it so happens that whatever God commands must be transmitted through his prophet, who's in this case, the one offering this polygamous marriage proposal to begin with. God merely wants his people to be happy. If that happiness happens to involve the prophet raping teenagers, then God knows the fullness of the circumstances, which makes that situation right and moral, even if it feels wrong to the person who is victimized by the act. Good thing the true kingdom of God operates by these means of revelation that completely nullify our inherent human morality that evolved over millions of years. One guy in the 19th century completely overthrows millions of years of evolution by a simple, thus saith the Lord. He continues, Whatever God requires is right, no matter what it is, although we may not see the reason thereof till long after the events transpire. If we seek first the kingdom of God, all good things will be added. So with Solomon, first he asked wisdom, and God gave it him. And with every desire of his heart, even things which might be considered abominable to all those who understand the order of heaven only in part, but which in reality were right, because God gave and sanctioned by special revelation. Given the basis of this argument, I can't find a flaw in Joe's logic. I mean, give me a second here. For the sake of understanding his argument, we have to grant the existence of the God of the Bible, which provided a safe haven for stoning unruly children, for purchasing and beating slaves, stealing wives and daughters of civilizations that the Israelites plundered and enslaving those people, drowning in the entire planet because of a hissy fit, burning cities to the ground, human sacrifices, burnt offerings, committing genocide of people who simply live on land that God gave to his people, or for simply believing in the wrong God. Countless other atrocities are not only seen as morally good, but as commanded by God in the Bible. People are punished for not committing those atrocities in the Bible because they didn't follow God's commands. With that line of logic, Joe's arguments are absolutely sound. What can't be accomplished when your God commands you to do whatever you want? Joe then leans really hard into this moral relativism with a relatable little story. Quote, "A parent may whip a child, and justly too, because he stole an apple, whereas if the child had asked for the apple and the parent had given it, the child would have eaten it with a better appetite. There would have been no stripes. All the pleasures of the apple would have been secured, all the misery of stealing lost." I wonder what the apple thinks about the situation. This principle will justly apply to all of God's dealings with his children. Everything that God gives us is lawful and right, and it is proper that we should enjoy his gifts and blessings whenever and wherever he is disposed to bestow. But if we should seize upon those same blessings and enjoyments without law, without revelation, without commandment, those blessings and enjoyments would prove cursings and vexations in the end, and we should have to lie down in sorrow and wailings of everlasting regret. Once again, this is moral relativism at play. We can do stuff that's sinful if God commands us to do it. If we do it without God's commandment, then it's a sin. But if God commands it, that we do that sin and we disobey, then it's a sin if we don't obey him, which will be a cursing and a vexation. Who tells us? Remind me, who is it that tells us what God commands? Oh yeah, it's the guy who's making this marriage proposal to begin with. Our Heavenly Father is more liberal in his views and boundless in his mercies and blessings than we are ready to believe or receive, and at the same time is more terrible to the workers of iniquity, more awful in the executions of his punishments, and more ready to detect every false way than we are apt to suppose him to be. He will be inquired of by his children, he says. Ask and ye shall receive, seek and ye shall find. But if ye will take that which is not your own, or which I have not given you, you shall be rewarded according to your deeds. In that passage, Joe switches into mouthpiece of God mode for this section, which marks a shift from pontificating on God's ways and will to articulating God's words for himself. This is dangerous no matter what the subject is, and this subject so happens to be about Joe justifying raping a teenager, but any person wielding this amount of power over anybody, it never leads to more good for more people. Quote, "But no good thing will I withhold from them who walk uprightly before me, and do my will in all things, who will listen to my voice and to the voice of my servant, whom I have sent. For I delight in those who seek diligently to know my precepts, and abide by my laws of my kingdom. For all things shall be made known unto them in mine own due time, and in the end they shall have joy." End quote. There's overt coercion taking place in the form of commanding by the voice of God to do what Joe says because he's God's servant. But there's also subtle and covert coercion that if you don't follow these commands by Joe, then you won't have joy in the end. Which means if you're feeling anxious, if you're feeling depressed, or if you're feeling somehow devalued as a person because you don't agree with what you're being told, or the prophet of God is telling you something that is contrary to your understanding or your conception of God or God's laws, well, that's because you are at fault. you aren't following God's words. Those bad feelings are your own fault, so you better follow God's commands and submit to the advances of the Lord's servant, and thereby abide in the laws of God's kingdom. If you just do this, if you submit to this encounter, you shall have joy, and all things shall be made known to you in God's own due time. This provides a unique window into Joe's manipulation tactics and his overall charisma and what drove it. It's yet another aspect of his leadership, which self-selects those who will follow. Whoever doesn't believe this load of hot, coercive garbage simply doesn't believe it. Those who do become marks of the conman, and he holds their lives in his hands. The argument didn't convince Nancy, probably because the thought of being Joe's side piece didn't give her happiness. Or maybe she didn't believe that he was the mouthpiece of God because Nancy had watched firsthand the evolution of Joe from prophet of God to revolutionary madman, and she didn't want any part of it. Nancy went and told her parents, and her parents told other people. Then Joe complained to a friend that she had to go and blab it, that's a quote, and Hinchpin Sidney Rigdon confronted Joe about it in the Rigdon home, and, of course, Joe denied the whole thing to her parents' faces. Nancy overheard this confrontation between Joe and Sidney and Phoebe Rigdon, and she stormed into the room declaring, quote, "Joseph Smith, you are telling that which is not true. You did make such a proposition to me, and you know it," end quote. In response, Joe admitted that the proposal had happened, but said that he had done it in order to test Nancy's virtue, because every con man worth his salt knows exactly where to find the nearest exit. Sidney Rigdon wasn't fooled. He knew Joe, and he and Joe never fully repaired their relationship again after this time. But Joe told the Rigdons to keep their mouths shut, and he worked to discredit Nancy by spreading rumors that she was a whore. Yet another pattern that we tease out of women who rejected his advances, and then him going on campaigns to assassinate their characters. We're going to discuss that with Sarah Pratt coming up in a little while. Eliza Snow, another one of Joe's wives, wrote a nasty poem about Nancy Rigdon called The Tattler, which is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, a poetic call for women to shut up about polygamy and keep Joe's secrets. Eliza had become Joe's wife just a couple months before this confrontation, so she was an insider who proved an invaluable resource to ensure compliance, especially during the Utah era. We're going to discuss Eliza R. Snow in a few minutes because she's a really complicated figure. What I want to do next here is highlight a trend that we're going to see come through as we continue to go through the proposals into later and later Nauvoo history. And this trend existed in every aspect of Joe's life, not just polygamy, but it bears mentioning because it's most easily understood with respect to polygamy. The trend is escalation. Joe got bored easily, and he always wanted to chase after the next forbidden fruit. What started as an affair with the maid turned into a massive, far-reaching system of dozens of wives, with theological justifications that extend from eternity to eternity. Fanny Alger was a teenage housemaid in 1835 when the affair likely occurred, but by 1844, Joe had assaulted over half a dozen teenagers. He had a dozen wives with living husbands, and probably even pursued his own niece and his own sister. No matter how far he went, it was never enough to be satisfied. He would burn every bridge. He would ruin every relationship. He would send men on missions to spread the gospel, and he might have even had people killed to get more. What may have started as liberal free love ideal evolved into a vicious, structured, competitive, and deliberate system of consolidating power, acquisition of women as property, and serial rape. He devised an entire female organization to help, with the help of his wives, to cull through women who would agree to the system and maintain their silence while participating in it. It was always a matter of how far he could push boundaries before somebody would make him pay. He could never be satisfied. Just like his religion, he was young, scrappy, and hungry, and he was not going to throw away his plot for more power, wealth, and control. Keep this concept of escalation in mind as we progress through more of these stories. Next, let's talk about Sarah Pratt. As with Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, Joe approached Sarah Pratt while her husband, Orison Pratt, was away on a mission to England. According to John C. Bennett, Joe had his eye on Sarah for at least 2 years before he approached her in mid-1842. Bennett and Joe went together to the home where Sarah was living during her husband's absence. And according to Bennett, Smith said to her, quote, "Sister Pratt, the Lord has given you to me as one of my spiritual wives. I have the blessings of Jacob granted me, as he granted holy men of old, and I have long looked upon you with favor, and hope you will not deny me." She replied, "I care not for the blessings of Jacob, and I believe in no such revelations, neither will I consent under any circumstances. I have one good husband, and that is enough for me." End quote. In response, Joe went off to take out his sexual frustration with Louisa Beeman. It said because she lived nearby, but he subsequently returned 3 more times to try his luck at convincing Sarah Pratt, and each time she rejected him. Quote, "She at last told him, 'Joseph, if you ever attempt anything of the kind with me again, I will tell Mr. Pratt on his return home. I will certainly do it.' Joe replied, 'Sister Pratt, I hope you will not expose me, for if I am to suffer, all suffer, so do not expose me. Will you agree not to do so?' 'If,' said she, 'you will never insult me again, I will not expose you unless strong circumstances require it.' 'Well, Sister Pratt,' Joe says, 'you have refused me. It becomes sin unless sacrifice is offered.' And turning to me," meaning Bennett, he said, "General, if you are my friend, I wish you to procure a lamb and have it slain and sprinkle the doorposts and the gate with its blood, and take the kidneys and entrails and offer them upon an altar of 12 stones that have not been touched with a hammer as a burnt offering, and it will save me and my priesthood. Will you do it?" "I will," I replied. So I procured the lamb from Captain John T. Barnett, and it was slain by Lieutenant Stephen H. Goddard, and I offered the kidneys and entrails in sacrifice for Joe as he desired. And Joe said, "All is now safe. The destroying angel will pass over without harming any of us." End quote. Unfortunately for Joe, he just couldn't take Sarah's no for an answer. He had won this encounter by virtue of getting Sarah to agree not to tell anybody, but that wasn't good enough for him because he still wanted her. He always wanted more. Quote, "Time passed on in apparent friendship until Joe grossly insulted Mrs. Pratt again after her husband had returned home by approaching and kissing her. This highly offended her, and she told Mr. Pratt, who was much enraged, and went and told Joe never to offer an insult of the like again. Joe replied, 'I did not desire to kiss her. Bennett made me do it.'" End quote. Okay. Just consider the manipulation at play in that story. In order to defend himself and save face, Joe smeared both Sarah Pratt and John C. Bennett by this one little act of kissing her. He weaponized this kiss and Orson Pratt's jealousy and effectively destroyed multiple relationships by using this as an opportunity to begin a character assassination campaign against Sarah, which lasts to this day. It still exists even among believing Mormon historians today. And Joe did so by claiming that he had found Pratt and Bennett in a bed together. And to go a step further and gain more credibility in the public eye, Joe also recruited Stephen Goddard's wife to back up the allegation. Mrs. Goddard claimed that she witnessed Bennett touching Sarah's breasts. Mrs. Goddard also asserted that, quote, "Mrs. Pratt stated to me that Dr. Bennett told her that he could cause abortion with perfect safety to the mother at any stage of pregnancy, and that he had frequently destroyed and removed infants before their time to prevent exposure of the parties, and that he had instruments for that purpose, etc." End quote. Sarah Pratt herself backed up Bennett's versions of events. She confirmed Mrs. Goddard's claim that Bennett performed abortions, but in her version, Bennett was doing it on Joe's behalf in order to prevent exposure of the parties, as Mrs. Goddard had said, rather than his own behalf. Published in 1886 by Wilhelm Weimettel, there's a new salacious detail involved in that expose, that Joe had Bennett performing abortions for him. She says, quote, "I observed that he held something in the left sleeve of his coat. Bennett smiled and said, 'Oh, on my way for a little job for Joseph. One of his women is in trouble.' Saying this, he took the thing out of his left sleeve. It was a pretty long instrument of a kind I had never seen before. It seemed to be of steel and was crooked at one end. I heard afterwards that the operation had been performed, that the woman was very sick, and that Joseph was very much afraid that she might die, but she recovered. You often hear that Joseph had no polygamous offspring. The reason of this is very simple. Abortion was practiced on a large scale in Nauvoo. Dr. John C. Bennett, the evil genius of Joseph, brought this abomination into a scientific system. He showed to my husband and me the instruments with which he used to operate for Joseph. There was a house in Nauvoo right across the flat, about 1.5 miles from the town, a kind of hospital. They sent the women there when they showed signs of celestial consequences. Abortion was practiced regularly in this house, end quote. Lucinda Morgan Pendleton Harris added this detail in that same conversation with Wilhelm Wymettle in 1886, quote, "Many little bodies of newborn children floated down the Mississippi," end quote. Lucinda and Sarah were good friends. When Joe first propositioned Sarah, she went to Lucinda to talk about it, and Lucinda's reply to Sarah's revelation that Joe proposed to her, quote, "To my utter astonishment, she said, laughing heartily, 'How foolish you are! I don't see anything so horrible in it. Why, I am his mistress since 4 years!'" End quote. Lucinda's reaction to Sarah Pratt telling her about this polygamous proposal, that's yet another complication to the narrative of polygamy. I'm going to try my best to kind of deal with that, throughout and near the end of the episode of today. Now, Lucy Walker Smith Kimball was another one of Joe's plural wives. She once wrote that Joseph's sons, quote, "seem surprised that there was no issue from asserted plural marriages with their father. Could they but realize the hazardous life he lived after that revelation was given, they would comprehend the reason. He was harassed and hounded and lived in constant fear of being betrayed by those who ought to have been true to him," end quote. She may have simply been saying that Joseph didn't have much opportunity for sex with his wives. On the other hand, she may have been implying that he took medical measures, hazardous medical measures, in order to prevent unwanted pregnancies with the help of John C. Reckitt Bennett. Sarah Pratt, by the way, went to Utah with her husband Orson, but she remained an unbeliever in Mormonism for the rest of her life, and she quietly taught her children not to believe in it either. She eventually left her quote-unquote gray-headed husband Orson in 1868 after he married a 16-year-old girl when he was in his 60s, in what Sarah considered to be a quote-unquote mockery of a marriage. Now, because of Sarah's lack of faith in the church and, of course, her unvarnished view of the situation and her claims about abortion to conceal the doctrine, faithful historians today completely write her off, and they tend to believe that everything she said was just salacious rumors, and she did it just to attack the prophet, the one true prophet of God, and therefore everything that she says is not trustworthy. They're all using motivated reasoning built on Joseph Smith's character assassination campaign, and there's simply no good reason to discount anything Sarah Pratt ever said, even in her later life. People who disbelieve Sarah are intellectual hacks who write off any evidence that contradicts their pet narratives. As for John C. Bennett, he only lasted in the church for a couple of years before he and several other men got excommunicated in May of 1842 for quote-unquote illicit intercourse with various women. It wouldn't be illicit if Joe approved of him, but it was illicit because, well, they were not approved by the one true prophet. The trial record is fascinating because the several men involved in this practice, they weren't doing polygamy, they were just having extramarital sex and giving religious justifications for it, which they attributed to Joseph Smith. For instance, they told women that the prohibition against adultery, quote, did not mean single women, but married women, end quote, and that Joseph Smith had privately taught them that extramarital sex wasn't a sin if they kept the secret to themselves. Several of these men gave money or food in exchange for sex, effectively treating the women as prostitutes. Considering Nauvoo economy, it was one of the very few ways that women were able to make money in the city. Well, the exposés from John C. Bennett and from Joseph Jackson, they reveal how horrible the living conditions for these women actually were. And I believe that Nauvoo prostitution to be the origin of what was called the Widow's Row, which was essentially a line of small cabins in the downtown district used as like rent by the hour boarding rooms, episodes 67 and 141. The trial record with these excommunications in May of 1842 also gives additional support to Sarah's claim that John C. Bennett performed abortions. Catherine Fuller says that Bennett sexually propositioned her, quote, "If I should become pregnant, he said he would attend to that. I understand that he would give medicine to prevent it," end quote. Sarah Miller says that when Chauncey Higbee propositioned her, he told her that Bennett, quote, "would come and take it away if there was a pregnancy," end quote. She also added that Bennett wanted to carry her off and wanted to give her medicine which she could administer to her husband that would cause her husband to die, making their marriage legal. Once it became public that Bennett was propositioning so many women to have affairs and was performing these abortions by testimonies from Catherine Fuller, from Sarah Miller, from Hiram sidekick of Smith, it required Joe and the other elites to basically distance themselves from Bennett so as not to be looped in with the saintly scoundrel, as he's been labeled by believing historians since he broke off from the church. Thus, the term spiritual wifery became used as a derogatory label against Reckitt Bennett and William Smith and other Mormon elites who were exposed, while the term celestial marriage or new and everlasting covenant were manufactured to label just those polygamous marriages which were sanctioned by the prophet. So the lines that historians use to delineate between spiritual wifery and celestial marriage, that was born out of necessity of assassinating Bennett's character and casting his sexual practices into the category of sin, while still allowing exemptions for Joseph Smith's practices, even though, in effect, they were functionally the same. This is post hoc labeling, as those lines didn't exist until Bennett defected from the church and he exposed all of the salacious practices existing in the underbelly of Nauvoo in his book History of the Saints. Prior to spring of 1842, Joe and Bennett were best buds with similar goals in mind and revolutionary prospects. We can't escape that fact. But their relationship started to fall apart for complicated reasons, and by May of 1842, Joe was paranoid that Bennett was trying to kill him, which very well may have happened. We can't be sure of the reasons for this alienation, except that Joe had let Bennett accumulate way too much power and was starting to see him as a threat. Episodes 115, 119, and 120. So when Bennett's adultery ring exploded, when by virtue Joe's as well, Joe was ready to be rid of Bennett. So Bennett had been too open and brazen with his spiritual wifery system, which threatened the fragile system of secrecy that Joe had been constructing for the past decade, over a decade, which was known as celestial marriage. Honestly, considering the women Joe had propositioned leading up to spring of 1842, he'd been cultivating relationships and grooming most of these women for years. Bennett had been there for 2 years and was suddenly hitting up women all over town to sleep with him. Bennett was a threat to everything that Joe had been working on for over a decade. Add into the mix the fact that Bennett was running a brothel in Nauvoo to connect any of the elites or any, visiting wealthy men with quick satisfaction of their lusts. Bennett was completely rogue and could no longer be trusted or controlled. Eventually, he was removed over infighting and disagreements ranging from political to polygamy to even pistolback in Porter Rockwell, pulling the trigger on Lilburn Boggs. Check out the Bennett Meltdown episodes 119 through 134, and then Porter Rockwell and Boggs episode 109. Sarah Pratt, going back to her, discusses a Mrs. White who worked as a madam, probably in Bennett's brothel or maybe in one of Joe's brothels. Quote, "I have told you that the prophet Joseph used to frequent houses of ill fame. Mrs. White, a very pretty and attractive woman, once confessed to me that she made a business of it to be hospitable to captains of the Mississippi steamboats. She told me that Joseph had made her acquaintance very soon after his arrival in Nauvoo, and that he had visited her dozens of times. My husband, Orson Pratt, could not be induced to believe such things of his prophet. Seeing his obstinate incredulity, Mrs. White proposed to Mr. Pratt and myself to put us in a position where we could observe what was going on between herself and Joseph the prophet. We, however, declined this proposition. Next door to my house was a house of bad reputation. One single woman lived there, not very attractive. She used to be visited by people from Carthage whenever they came to Nauvoo. Joseph used to come on horseback, ride up to the house and tie his horse to a tree, many of which stood before the house. Then he would enter the house of the woman from the back. I have seen him do this repeatedly." End quote. It's so weird that faithful Mormon historians don't trust Sarah Pratt. It's like she left behind abundant information that makes these historians feel really yucky inside, so they choose to completely disregard anything and everything that she ever said. Just because somebody says something with which you disagree or makes you feel uncomfortable, that doesn't mean they are wrong. It could mean that you're wrong, and you don't like what they say because it doesn't match with what you understand the world to be. This statement reveals a troubling and rarely discussed aspect of Nauvoo polygamy. We have solid documentation on over 30 wives of Joseph Smith, but that says absolutely nothing about the number of sexual partners he actually had, when he could go to any of the brothels in Nauvoo to satisfy his urges without going through the whole rigmarole of like courting women and grooming them for a decade, the women who were in the elite class of the city. So if Joe could just satisfy his sexual urges, then why go after the wives and the daughters of his friends? Prostitutes were playthings to him. The women he actually knew were games. Somebody you give money to for a night of fun, that doesn't include the thrill of the pursuit. Hiring sex workers is, it's hypocritical given the religion that he was and his statue in the religion that he ran, but it isn't taboo the same way any of the women that we have documentation for were. Apologists will claim that polygamy wasn't motivated by sex, but by a divine mandate to which Joseph Smith and others in Nauvoo begrudgingly complied, only after being threatened with angels and flaming swords. I would agree that polygamy wasn't motivated by sex alone. It wasn't just about sex. It was about power. It was a game to him. It was the thrill of chasing the forbidden fruit and seeing how far he could push boundaries. If it were only about sex, then Joe would have taken care of his urges at any of the brothels around town, and we wouldn't have much to discuss on today's episode. So when the conversation comes up about how much sex was involved in polygamy, the question doesn't matter much in my mind because the conversation should be about power and control. Nauvoo was a kingdom of sex, a kingdom of sex. But in a few rare instances, it was also a queendom of sex. We'll talk about that when we get to Eliza R. Snow in just a second here. Meanwhile, on May 3rd, 1842, Joe introduced the Mormon Temple Endowment Ceremony. According to an 1846 expose by a woman named Maria Van Dusen, at the beginning of the ceremony, Maria and her husband were separated and directed down two separate hallways. At the end of the hall, a female conductor met Maria and divested her of her outer clothing, all but her undergarments and her stockings. Then she proceeded to another small room where she met another female conductor who required her to strip off the rest of her clothing, leaving her, quote, in a perfect state of nakedness, end quote. According to Maria Van Dusen, the conductor, quote, next takes this nude female into a bath of water and washes her all over from head to foot, with a similar ceremony to what follows. I wash you for the purposes thus and so, end quote. Then the officiator dumped a cow's horn of perfumed oil over her head and rubbed it by hand all over her body. Then she was seated, quote, ordained to be a queen from this time forth and forever, and presented with a new undergarment that had Masonic symbols cut into it. At this point, the man and wife are reintroduced to each other, and there's a dramatic reenactment of the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, with the president of the church playing the role of God. In Maria's ceremony, it was Brigham Young, played by God, and Orson Hyde played the devil. But in 1842, it would have been Joseph Smith playing God and Double Dub Phelps who played the devil. At this point in the ceremony where Adam and Eve realized they're naked, the initiates were given small white aprons with green silk fig leaves pasted on the front of them. After this dramatic portion of the endowment, there was some instruction by the church president. Among other things, he told the women that her husband would rule over her and explained the meanings of the marks that are cut into her garment. The initiates took oaths of secrecy under penalty of death should they break the oath, and then the husband and wife were symbolically ushered into the celestial kingdom. They were crowned a king and queen and instructed in the doctrine of plural marriage, episodes 100, 110, and 111. Under Brigham Young, thousands of Mormons rushed through this ceremony in the Nauvoo Temple before heading west towards Utah. Mexico at the time. But under Joseph Smith, it was only a very small handful of elites, the inner circle members of the Holy Order or the Quorum of the Anointed. These were vetted members of the church who he knew could be trusted, and he used the endowment ceremony to bind them to secrecy before ritually introducing them to the mystery of plural marriage, among other things. Now, I'm going to take this moment to say that the temple ceremony has gone through multiple evolutions, with elements added, removed, or changed throughout the decades as societal pressures have dictated. Most recently, the language was altered to be far less sexist, and we're currently waiting to see how COVID-19 is going to affect the temple ordinances once the temples reopen here at the end of 2020, maybe. The temple ceremony is a living ceremony. It's a living ritual, and it changes as situations necessitate. With that said, the original endowment introduced by Joseph Smith has been lost to history. The reason for this is the people who went through, they were all vetted members that Joe Smith personally knew that he could trust. They could all be trusted, and he knew that they would keep tight lips. Once the Nauvoo Temple was completed under Bloody Brigham's direction, the secrets couldn't be kept among thousands of people who were processed through the ceremony, and we know almost exactly what it looked like from contemporary exposés. Joe's ceremony, however, can only be constructed to about 80 to 90% accuracy with the very few documents we have that describe it in oblique details. We'll discuss a few details of the temple ceremony near the end of today's episode because it reveals some troubling details that are ripe for speculation. In June of 1842, the same month that John Fremont left for his first expedition to the Oregon Trail, Joe married Eliza R. Snow, who was living as a boarder in the Smith home and working as Emma's secretary for the Relief Society. Eliza Snow was 38 years old at the time, so actually one of his more age-appropriate wives. She was also single, so no troublesome husband to deal with. Now, we don't know the details of Joe's proposal to her, but Eliza did write about her reaction to it. Quote, "When first plural marriage was suggested to me, I would not listen to the matter. The idea was repugnant, abhorrent. I was like any other young woman who had the beau and suitors for her hand. I wanted to share a husband with no woman, but I was told it was God's command, and I went to God and asked God to enlighten me, and he did. I saw and felt that plural marriage was not only right, but that it was the only true manner of living up to the Gospels, and I quenched my womanly emotions and entered the order." End quote. According to Eliza, quote, "As I increased in knowledge concerning the principle and design of plural marriage, I grew in love with it." She considered her marriage to Joseph Smith as one of the most important circumstances of my life and one I have never had cause to regret. End quote. All right, let's try to unbox Eliza and some other less discussed aspects of Mormon polygamy. I've made no qualms about the fact that Eliza R. Snow is my historical crush, but needless to say, our relationship is really complicated and she's not one I'm writing home to mama about. For some women, polygamy was an opportunity to break away from the incredibly repressive and abusive system of monogamy. An idealized version without patriarchal power structures still is, to this day, exactly that. Eliza R. Snow was somebody who flourished in polygamy. Her success story provides a unique window into trends that polygamy created and still creates today in fundamentalist sects. Mormonism is a high-demand and viciously competitive cult. This is felt equally by both accepted genders in the confines of the theology. For men, it forces holier-than-thou competition to rise through leadership ranks. For women, it forces competition with the women around them to be the most active in the church, to have the most kids, to attend the most meetings, to bake the most cakes, to visit the most fellow sisters in the Relief Society, and to wear the nicest clothes. Any metric of cultural competition is exacerbated by this Mormon hierarchical structure. For women like Eliza R. Snow, an independent and progressive thinker who's also power-hungry, polygamy presents an alternative to a life of subservience to her husband and doing chores and raising kids. Eliza, especially because she didn't have any children of her own, was allowed to use her time to write, to organize, to preach and lecture, to coordinate, and to evolve the Society of Utah, tendencies which were developed and fostered in Nauvoo polygamy. When women aren't forced to stay home every day raising kids, they get stuff done, often much to the chagrin of the men who hold dominion over them in this belief structure. For women who don't like their husband very much because they were forced into the marriage, every night that he spends with another of his wives is a night that she doesn't have to tolerate a man whom she doesn't love or maybe even doesn't like. Maybe she was given to this man by her father as a business deal. Maybe he was the best option and she's settled like Emma did with Joe. Maybe she's not all that attracted to men to begin with. Maybe he's abusive. Or maybe her intelligence is better utilized in organizing society and offering services of midwifery, making herbal remedies, and, acting as a doctor, teaching school, or anything else that women were allowed to do by society at this time. If her sister wives are helping to raise the kids, suddenly a couple days of every week open up for her to engage in other pursuits where she may find more fulfillment instead of just cooking, cleaning, and raising the kids. With enough women who have enough free time afforded by that system, they can organize support networks. They can build hospitals and orphanages. They can construct curricula for schools where they teach. They can write their own periodicals focused on women's issues and do lots of other stuff that they otherwise couldn't do without polygamy. It's one of those aspects. It's one of those details of polygamy that we just have to keep in our mind. It was in this societal structure where people like Eliza R. Snow, Zina Diantha Huntington, Emma Lyon Wells, and many other women flourished and eventually contributed to the larger women's suffrage movement at the turn of the 20th century. None of what I just said, though, should be construed to ignore the abuses and the disturbing misogyny of Mormon polygyny. That's been the entire focus of the episode. Most of our polygamy episodes and the focus of most books discussing the history of polygamy from a critical lens. I'm merely discussing this now to further contextualize some of the many complexities that polygamy provides. In addition to this, polygamy in Utah was different than polygamy in Nauvoo, but to some extent, women had say in who their sister wife would be. Husbands were to consult with and gain the approval of their first wife before they took another wife. Now, there was always the law of Sarah Dodge, which we're going to get into here, where if that wife didn't approve of whoever he wanted to take as a second wife, then she would be damned. But the actual practice, especially in Utah, contained a great deal of variability with respect to the letter of the law and how it was actually implemented and practiced. That is to say, that the many societal benefits gained through progressive and egalitarian polyamory today were also captured to some degree in Mormon polygamy. I'm skeptical that the criteria of informed consenting adults can ever be truly achieved in a religious polygynous system because the theology requires a man to lord over his wives. By its very design, it's incapable of achieving those criteria of informed consenting adults. The issue is very complicated, and we shouldn't discount or ignore the experiences of women who not only preferred the system of polygamy, but flourished within it, like Eliza R. Snow did. I may say a little bit more about that at the end of the episode today, but I wanted to spend a little time on that tangent here. The following month, in July of 1842, Joe ended up marrying Bishop Newell K. Whitney's 17-year-old daughter, Sarah Ann Whitney, with Newell performing the ceremony. Joe had first met Sarah in 1831 when Sarah was 5 years old. As usual, Joe brought his marriage proposal to Newell rather than directly to Sarah. According to Helen Mar Kimball, quote, "The bishop, with his wife, had for years been called Mother Whitney, retired together and unitedly besought the Lord for a testimony whether or not this principle was from him. And they ever after bore testimony that they received a manifestation and that it was so powerful they could not mistake it. The bishop never afterwards doubted, and they willingly gave to him their daughter, which was the strongest proof that they could possibly give their faith and confidence in him as a true prophet of God. Sarah Ann took this step of her own free will." That's a complicated topic, isn't it? Sarah Ann took this step of her own free will. I kind of disagree with that. Helen continues. "But had to do it unbeknown to her brother Horace Whitney, which grieved her most, and also her mother, that they could not open their hearts to him. But Joseph feared to disclose it, believing that the Higbee boys would soon embitter Horace against him, as they had already caused serious trouble, and for this reason he favored his going east, which Horace was not slow to accept." End quote. So to summarize that, Joe approached Sarah's parents, the Whitneys, and thought that her brother Horace was going to be a problem, so he sent Horace on a mission. Sarah eventually did tell Horace Whitney about the whole marriage after he returned from his mission, and he ended up accepting the doctrine as well, instead of aligning with the Higbee brothers, who would later go on to publish the Nauvoo Expositor, which is what Joe feared. This presents another painful question worth exploration. What kind of parents give their 17-year-old daughter away to be a secret mistress of a middle-aged man? Sarah Ann's mother, Elizabeth Whitney, later explained in the Women's Exponent magazine in Utah how they came to their decision. Quote, "We pondered upon the matter continually, and our prayers were unceasing that the Lord would grant us some special manifestation concerning this new and strange doctrine. The Lord was very merciful to us. He revealed unto us his power and glory. We were seemingly wrapped in a heavenly vision, and a halo of light encircled us, and we were convinced in our own bosoms that God heard and approved our prayers and intercedings before him." End quote. I tend to wonder if they had dinner at the prophet's house before they experienced this hallucination. The Whitneys were certainly not the only parents who gave their daughter to the prophet. Helen Mar Kimball, who we're going to talk about in a minute, said that her parents, agreeing to Joe's proposition when she was 14 years old, quote, "My father had but one ewe lamb, but willingly laid her upon the altar." End quote. The thing is, Joe drove a hard bargain. You have eternal salvation if you just give your teenage daughter to me, and you keep your mouth shut about it. Yeah, I know it hurts right now, knowing your daughter is going to be traumatized. She's going to hate you for your entire lives, and she's not even going to have the language to understand what's happening to her. But all of the discomfort that you two are going to have to live with, all of that, that's going to be but a moment of suffering for an eternity of bliss. What does Helen think about this? What does Sarah Ann Whitney think about this? Why would we care? This transaction is between adults, and she's only a commodity with which to purchase your exaltation. The Kimballs really believed this. The Whitneys really believed this. Every parent couple who gave their daughter to the prophet, every man who gave his wife to the prophet, they all believed that they were choosing short-term discomfort and jealousy and trauma and suffering in exchange for an eternity of godhood. A brief anecdote to drive this home. Now, super duper content warning here because I'm about to share some Warren Jeffs stuff, the modern Joseph Smith. During my first trip to Short Creek, I was allowed to tour the former home of Warren Jeffs, the currently incarcerated leader of the FLDS, the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. His home is something like 27 bedrooms, 2 massive kitchens, multiple huge living spaces, 3 stories. Altogether, it's something like 35,000 square feet. The person giving us the tour took us into the entryway and pointed to a room just off the entryway of the home, which served as Warren Jeffs' personal office. Now, how this would work was parents would bring their daughters to this home, and they would wait in the entryway, and the daughter would go into Jeff's office, where Warren Jeffs would go about describing the daughter's sins and proceed to tear down her physical appearance. After that, he would take her across the hall to his personal bedroom, where the tour guide pointed out to us the heavily padded carpet for the purposes of sound deadening. This would all happen while the parents sat in the entryway of the home, 23 feet away from the bedroom door where Jeffs was assaulting their daughter. Now, I don't share that story to be gratuitous. I share it because it is simply the harsh reality of what this actually looks like in practice, and to illustrate that what happened in Nauvoo in the 19th century isn't some foreign land or distant memory. Now, stuff happens to this day in fundamentalist sects all over the world. And because polygamy is a criminal charge banned by most state constitutions, The people who suffer these abuses believe that they have nowhere to go and nobody to turn to, and they're taught that the entire world is led by Satan. Nothing in the world is available to them because it's all evil. All of the outside world is evil. It's us versus them mentality. They don't think they have anywhere to turn to remediate these abuses, and they don't even have the language to understand what these abuse practices are. Not all prophets are like this, but every prophet has the capacity to become this. Stuff like this slides under the radar of the justice system because religions enjoy incredible exemptions from basically any laws ever while never paying taxes. Everything that Joseph Smith did in Nauvoo is happening every day in the shadows of the monolith that is religion. The rest of the episode doesn't get a whole lot more pleasant from here. A month after the ceremony with the teenaged Sarah Ann Whitney, when the Whitneys gave their 17-year-old daughter to the prophet, Joseph Smith found himself hiding in Carlos Granger's basement after some officers from Missouri came looking for him in order to extradite him to bring him back to Missouri for treason, arson, and murder. That's not a sentence you're ever going to hear in church. While Joe was hiding in Carlos Granger's basement, Emma worked to keep the church running in his absence. She wrote a letter to the state governor on his behalf. She took care of the kids, and she clandestinely kept him apprised of the situation. Despite Emma's efforts on his behalf, Joe apparently used this downtime while he was in hiding to meet with his new plural wife behind Emma's back. Joe wrote a letter to the Whitney family to set up the encounter. And the letter, which is one of the few letters that we have in Joe's actual handwriting, explained where he was hiding and then assured the Whitneys, quote, "I have a room entirely by myself. The whole matter can be attended to with most perfect safety. I know it is the will of God that you should comfort me now in this time of affliction. The only thing to be careful of is to find out when Emma comes. Then you cannot be safe. But when she is not here, there is the most perfect safety. I think Emma won't come tonight. If she don't, then don't fail to come tonight." End quote. Maybe Joe was just really lonely. He wanted some good long-time friends as company while he was in hiding. But if this is just a letter about Joe wanting some company while he was in hiding of the three Whitneys, why did he ask them to avoid Emma? Why does he stress the fact that he has a private room entirely to himself? Joe and Emma's first friends upon their arrival to Kirtland was the Whitney family. Why would he want to keep that visit from her? According to the book Mormon Enigma, quote, "The evening after Joseph wrote the letter, he went home under the cover of darkness and spent the night with Emma, returning to his hiding place after conducting some business the next day." End quote. So he spent the evening with Sarah Ann and spent the night with Emma as if nothing happened. What does this say about Joseph Smith that he could rape a teenager and then still go home to Emma and look her in the eye? By the way, have I mentioned Emma was also pregnant with his kid at this time? Emma continued doing a lot of business for Joe throughout the rest of her pregnancy here, although in October she fell severely ill, probably from malaria or maybe something to do with the pregnancy. And on December 26th, 1842, amidst the throes of a fever, she delivered yet another stillborn child, her fourth failed pregnancy. We can't imagine what this was like. And maybe some of you can empathize with what it's like to lose a child in birth, but considering everything else that was going on at the time, and state officials trying to arrest and execute her husband for treason and everything else that was going on, we can never put our minds where Emma's must have been during the end of 1842. Fortunately for Emma, she had some boarders who were living in her home who helped her out during her recovery, including Sarah and Maria Lawrence, Lucy and William Walker, Emily and Eliza Partridge, Eliza R. Snow, and Jane Manning James. Unfortunately for Emma, Joe had married Eliza R. Snow just a few months previously, and he was busily grooming the rest of the girls in the house to become his wives as well. By the end of 1842, Joe had married over a dozen women, including Agnes Moulton Coolbrith, his widow sister-in-law, Sylvia Porter Sessions Lyon, Mary Elizabeth Rollins Leitner, Patty Bartlett Sessions, Marinda Nancy Johnson, Elizabeth Davis Brackenbury Durfee, Sarah Ann Fuller, Sarah Marietta Kingsley Howe Cleveland, Delsina Johnson, Eliza R. Snow, Sarah Ann Whitney, Martha McBride, and Sarah Babson. Once again, these are the women we have good documentation for. It says nothing about any of his stops at the city brothels. About February of 1843, an altercation is supposed to have happened between Emma Smith and Eliza R. Snow. The details of this altercation are shrouded in mystery and clouded by oral history and folklore. This is one of those stories in Mormon history that historians have been wrestling with for over a century to figure out exactly what happened. But the gist of the story is that Eliza was noticeably pregnant. Emma witnessed Joe kissing her, and that was the breaking point in a somewhat peaceful tension that was going on in the home. And in a fit of rage and jealousy, Emma either pushed Eliza down the stairs or beat her with a broomstick or both. And as a result of this violence, Eliza miscarried and lost her unborn child and was kicked out of the Smith home. Unfortunately, the accounts of this incident are all third or fourth hand, and they're written long after the fact. And they also contradict each other in some details. There's also nothing in Eliza's journal to corroborate the story, and in fact, the journal leaves very little room for Eliza to ever have been pregnant to begin with. Probably neither the stair-pushing nor the miscarriage actually happened. There's something that did happen there, but the part about Emma catching Eliza and Joe together, however, that seems to have been true, and as a result, of course, Emma kicked Eliza out of the house, just as she had done with Fanny Alger 6 years earlier, episode 137. Over the next few months into early 1843, Joe and Emma had a lot of fights about polygamy, and eventually they came to a couple of compromises. First, as we discussed last episode, Emma agreed to let Joe kind of mess around, sort of, as long as she could mess around as well. Joe eventually rescinded this part of the deal once he received Doctrine and Covenants 132. Second, Emma also agreed that Joe could marry younger women as long as Emma got to vet them first. In the Bible, Abraham's wife Sarah had chosen her maidservant Hagar to be Abraham's concubine. Emma wanted the same veto power over her husband's partners as Sarah did. This came to be known as the Law of Sarah. The first wives that Emma approved under this new compromise were the Partridge sisters and the Lawrence sisters, all of whom lived in Joe and Emma's home, where Emma could keep an eye on everybody. What Emma didn't know when she and Joe hammered out this agreement in May of 1843 was that Joe had already married the Partridge sisters 2 months before. According to Emily Partridge, Joe had first approached her in 1842 and asked her if she would promise to burn a private letter after reading it if he wrote that letter to her. She initially agreed to, but then she had second thoughts and she asked him not to send her any private letters. For the time being, he agreed not to. Later, in February 1843, after the Partridge sisters had seen Emma kick Eliza Snow out of the house for being Joe's plural wife, Emily received a visit from Elizabeth Durfee. Elizabeth Durfee was one of Joe's plural wives who knew all about polygamy, but Emily didn't know. Durfee played dumb, apparently, and pretended to have heard rumors about polygamy and then kind of, test the waters and ask Emily if she had any information or what her thoughts were on this. Emily successfully passed Durfee's test by keeping Joe's secrets. In this case, Elizabeth Durfee operated as one of the mothers in Israel, one of the older women liaisons who helped Joe acquire teenage wives. So Mrs. Durfee then set up a meeting between Emily and Joe at Heber the Creeper Kimball's house. When Emily showed up for that meeting, Heber made a show of turning her away from the front door, but then he ran and caught up with her and then quietly took her around back to meet up with Joe. Joe told her, quote, "The Lord had commanded me to enter into plural marriage and had given me to him. And although I had got badly frightened, he knew I would yet have him." End quote. So Emily agreed to the marriage, quote, "And I was married there and then. Joseph went home his way and I going home my way alone. A strange way of getting married, wasn't it?" End quote. The date for that occurrence was March 4th, 1843. 4 days later, Joe married Emily's younger sister, Eliza Partridge, as well. Mrs. Durfee filled the role of mother in Israel, one of these woman liaisons to help test the waters, teach the doctrine, and then to help facilitate a meeting of these younger women for Joe to acquire as his wives. Then, 2 months later, Joe and Emma reached their compromise that allowed Emma to choose Joe's plural wives, and she chose the Partridge sisters. Joe didn't dare tell her that he'd already married them, so according to Emily, quote, "To save family trouble, Brother Joseph thought it best to have another ceremony performed. Emma had her feelings, and so we thought there was no use in saying anything about it so long as she had chosen us herself." Emily also remembered that Emma, quote, "helped explain the principles to us," end quote. So at least in this regard, in a few of these marriages, Emma had a say in what transpired and how things operated. And it seems as if Joe seriously took into consideration Emma's thoughts and feelings here. But Joe wasn't satisfied with just the Partridge sisters, so Emma also selected the Lawrence sisters for him. Originally from Canada and friends of William and Jane Law, Sarah and Maria Lawrence had moved to Missouri and then to Nauvoo with their father, Edward Lawrence, who died about March of 1840, when Sarah and Maria were 17 and 14 years old. Joseph Smith became their legal guardian in June of 1841 because their mother wasn't legally eligible to manage Edward's estate and to, be the ward over her children unless she was married to another man. So she eventually married Josiah Butterfield, who petitioned to become the girls' guardian and to take over management of their estate. But Joe refused to even meet with Josiah Butterfield and even threw him out of the house, out of the Nauvoo mansion by kicking his backside. We don't know exactly what happened to the girls' inheritance money, but it kind of looks like from the historical records that Joe just stole it. At the very least, he seems to have wanted the girls to continue living in his home to be sexually groomed, even though their mother could now be their legal guardian because she was remarried. So he finally married both of his wards in spring of 1843 when Maria was 19 and Sarah was 17. Unfortunately, we don't know very much else about this marriage, episode 213. What we do know is that at age 23, quote, Maria Lawrence died of consumption, or one might more truthfully put it, of a broken heart, end quote. And that was likely due to depression from the PTSD that she experienced from her sexual encounters with the prophet. So back to Newell and Avery's biography of Emma Smith, Mormon Enigma, quote, Emma's capitulation to these marriages, however, was only momentary. Emily wrote that Emma seemed to feel well until the ceremony was over, when almost before she could draw a second breath, she turned and was more bitter in her feelings than ever before, if possible. And before the day was over, she turned around or repented what she had done and kept Joseph up till very late in the night talking to him, end quote. And over the next 2 months, Emma watched the girls' rooms in an attempt to prevent Joe from sleeping with them. From Mormon Enigma again, quote, Emily remembered that Emma kept close watch on us. If we were missing for a few minutes and Joseph was not at home, the house was searched from top to bottom and from one end to the other. And if we were not found, the neighborhood was searched until we were found. Emma was not successful in keeping Joseph from meeting with his wives. Emily Partridge would one day testify under oath that she roomed with Joseph on the night of her second marriage to him, while Emma, she believed, was in the house at the time. She also testified that she had slept with him between her first marriage and the second ceremony, end quote. Finally, in July of 1843, Joe dictated the plural marriage revelation, which became Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. This is Joe's single most controversial revelation. It lays out the doctrine of sealing and what it terms as the new and everlasting covenant. It also lays out the path Mormons take in order to literally become gods of their own planets after death, which was further solidified by the King Follett Discourse, episodes 148, 149, 158, and 193 to 195. During the Nauvoo period, Joe received very few written revelations. He was obsessed with secrecy, so he couched his new doctrines in things like the Secret Temple Endowment or the Council of 50. D&C 132 was delivered, but it wasn't a public revelation. Only a few Mormon elites in Nauvoo were privy to the content of 132. The revelation wasn't actually publicly printed until 8 years after Joe's death in 1852 in Utah by Orson Pratt under Bloody Brigham Young's direction, when Utah became an openly polygamous territory. and it wasn't officially voted to be canonized as scripture until the October 1880 General Conference in Utah, 3 years after Bloody Brigham's death, when polygamy was under heavy fire from the United States government. The revelation is directed to Emma Smith. By July 1843, Joe had about 24 wives, which had put tremendous strain on his relationship with Emma. In the 1870s, William Clayton swore out an affidavit that explained the circumstances of Joe receiving this revelation. Quote, "On the morning of the 12th of July, 1843, Joseph and Hiram Smith came into the office in the upper story of the red brick store on the bank of the Mississippi River. They were talking on the subject of plural marriage. Hiram said to Joseph, 'If you will write the revelation on celestial marriage, I will take it and read it to Emma, and I believe I can convince her of its truth, and you will hereafter have its truth, and you will hereafter have peace.' Joseph smiled and remarked, 'You do not know Emma as well as I do.' Hiram repeated his opinion and further remarked, 'The doctrine is so plain, I can convince any reasonable man or woman of its truth, purity, and heavenly origin,' or words to their effect. Joseph then said, 'Well, I will write the revelation and we will see.' He then requested me to get paper and prepare to write. Hiram very urgently requested Joseph to write the revelation by means of the Urim and Thummim, but Joseph in reply said he did not need to, for he knew the revelation perfectly from beginning to end. Hiram then took the revelation to read to Emma. Joseph remained with me in the office until Hiram returned. When he came back, Joseph asked him how he had succeeded. Hiram replied that he had never received a more severe talking to in his life, that Emma was very bitter and full of resentment and anger. Joseph quietly remarked, 'I told you you did not know Emma as well as I did.' Joseph then put the revelation in his pocket, and they both left the office." End quote. So infuriated was Emma with this revelation that she actually burned the original copy. But that's okay, because Joe could recreate it anytime necessary, and we know that it was recreated and given to Joseph Kingsbury and Newell Knight, from which D&C 132 was printed. The revelation begins by saying that Joe has inquired of my hand to know and understand wherein I, the Lord, justified my servants Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and also Moses, David, and Solomon, my servants, as touching the principle and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines. God promises to answer the question, quote, "For behold, I reveal unto you a new and everlasting covenant. If ye abide not that covenant, then ye are damned. For no one can reject this covenant and be permitted to enter into my glory." End quote. The phrase, the new and everlasting covenant, has been around for a while. In Kurland, it simply meant the gospel of Mormonism, but D&C 132 reinterpreted the phrase, which now came to mean the system of plural marriage, that if anybody rejects it, they are damned. The revelation then goes on to explain that only one person on earth, the president of the church, has the power to perform eternal sealings. All baptismal and marriage covenants not authorized by Joseph Smith end at death. Those who aren't married for eternity can't become gods. At best, they can become angels bound to eternal servitude. That's because godhood requires the power of eternal reproduction. The gods, quote, "Glory shall be a fullness and a continuation of the seeds forever and ever," end quote. When what the prophet binds on earth, that's bound in heaven. All else is lost. After a long discussion of adultery, which basically says that sleeping with more than one person is an adultery if God authorizes it, the revelation finally gets to the part that's addressed to Emma. Quote, "And let mine handmaid Emma Smith receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph, and who are virtuous and pure before me. And I command mine handmaid Emma to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph, and to none else. But if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord. For I am the Lord thy God, and I will destroy her if she abide not in my law. And again, verily, verily, I say unto you, if any man have a wife who holds the keys of this power, and he teaches unto her the law of my priesthood as pertaining to these things, then shall she believe and administer unto him, or she shall be destroyed, saith the Lord your God. For I will destroy her, for I will magnify my name upon all those who receive and abide in my law." End quote. Emma was commanded to believe in plural marriage, accept Joe's plural wives, all of them that had been given to him, and be faithful to Joe, and only Joe, to cleave only unto him, or God would destroy her. The revelation also threatened that unless Emma behaved herself, the law of Sarah would no longer apply. Where she could approve of those wives. So Joe's revelations always included some kind of stopgap like this, right? And of course, polygamy revelation would be no different. People either abide by every aspect of his laws, or their die is cast, their lot is sown, and they shall have their reward. So next we got to talk about Helen Mar Kimball, famous for being Joe's youngest plural wife at age 14. Helen was born to Heber and Violet Kimball. Violet Kimball. People say it all differently. I'm going to say Violet Kimball. In New York, and she was born in 1828. She was just 3 years old when the Kimballs converted to the Mormon faith in 1832. 3 years old! As a child in Kirtland, Ohio, she attended school in a wing of Joe and Emma's home, and in 1839, she moved with her family to Nauvoo. Helen didn't have very many interactions with Joe during these years because she was a kid, right? Although she saw him preach a lot, and he came to the Kimball home to administer healing blessings when the Kimball family got malaria. Although it could be argued this was young enough that most of her memories from this period were lost by the time she was, older and recounting the events in Utah. A brief interaction occurred when Joe came over to the Kimball home sometime in 1842 when Helen was 13 years old. He was talking to Heber and Violet about some matter or another when he picked up a little doll that Heber had sent to Helen from Europe during his mission there a year and a half prior. Apparently, Joe squeezed the doll too hard and then the head of it fell off while it was in Joe's hands. According to Helen, Joe remarked, quote, "As that has fallen, so shall the heathen gods fall." And Helen's reaction is priceless. I stood there a silent observer, unable to understand or appreciate the prophetic words, but thought them a rather weak apology for breaking my doll's head off, end quote. Because of course that's what she thinks. She was 13 years old. So Joe married Helen the following year in May of 1843, as the church itself puts it, quote, several months before her 15th birthday, end quote. According to Helen, her father came to her one day and, quote, taught me the principle of celestial marriage, and having a great desire to be connected with the prophet, Joseph, he offered me to him. This I afterwards learned from the prophet's own mouth, end quote. I'm skeptical of the claim that it was Heber and not Joe who came up with this idea, especially since it was Joe who told her so. Maybe it was because Joe asked Heber for the lot, and Heber Heber just struck a deal and said, hey, I'm going to give you Helen, my 14-year-old daughter, instead of my wife. But anyway, continuing with Helen, quote, Father left me to reflect upon it for the next 24 hours. I was skeptical. 1 minute believed, then doubted. I thought of the love and tenderness that he felt for his only daughter, and I knew that he would not cast her off, and this was the only convincing proof that I had of it being right. She's 14. How is she going to be able to understand this? She doesn't even have the language to understand what's happening, let alone whether she believes that it's true or not. I knew that he loved me too well to teach me anything that was not strictly pure, virtuous, and exalting in its tendencies, and no one else could have influenced me at that time or brought me to accept of a doctrine so utterly repugnant and so contrary to all of our former ideas and traditions. The next morning, Joe came to the Kimball house, quote, and with my parents, I heard him teach and explain the principle of celestial marriage, after which he said to me, if you will take this step, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of your father's household and all of your kindred. This promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward. None but God and his angels could see my mother's bleeding heart. When Joseph asked her if she was willing, she replied, if Helen is willing, I have nothing more to say. End quote. That's a heavy quote. What could Violet say? The decision had been made between Joe and Heber. This was a business transaction, and Helen and Violet, their opinions didn't matter in this. They couldn't say, there was nothing either of them could say that would change this business transaction. Helen agreed to this, but what choice did she really have? Her parents had decided her fate, and she may not have also realized that the marriage would include sex. Catherine Lewis later remembered Helen telling her, quote, "I would never have been sealed to Joseph had I known it was anything more than a ceremony. I was young and they deceived me by saying the salvation of our whole family depended on it," end quote. So Helen was married to Joe in May at the age of 14, and in the following months she had lots of reasons to regret that decision that her parents made for her when her parents treated her like a caged bird. Apparently the prophet instructed Heber and Vallot not to let Helen go to any dances or associate with young men her own age. She hated being locked up because she loved dancing. She eventually got over it and became a full believer in polygamy, but she was really bitter about it at the time. Fortunately, her captivity here didn't last that long because Joe was killed really soon after. Good riddance. In late 1843, Emma Smith felt more and more like a prisoner as well. Joe was shutting her out of the church's business because of her vacillation about polygamy, and many of her old friends were keeping secret from her that they had also become Joe's plural wives. Emma filled too many roles of running Joe's business affairs, keeping the lid on the secrets of polygamy and the rumor mill that was a relief society, raising the kids through sickness and health of herself and of the kids, fending off constables who were trying to arrest her husband, and dozens of other tasks never to be known or recorded. One wonders why Eliza was pushed down the stairs instead of Joseph. Finally, in August of 1843, Emma played her strongest card. She threatened divorce, which spelled disaster for this power couple of Mormonism. Think of the optics. According to William Clayton, Joe, quote, had to tell her he would relinquish all for her sake, end quote. Relinquish all. In other words, that he would stop practicing polygamy and he would give up all of his plural wives. But Joe confided to Clayton that he didn't intend to keep his word. From Mormon Enigma again, quote, 5 days later, Joseph agreed to relinquish all. Emma found 2 letters in his pocket from Eliza R. Snow, who was still at the Morley settlement after her quick removal from the homestead. Emma said some harsh words. Still smarting from finding Eliza's letters to Joseph the previous day, Emma went for a short carriage ride with her husband on August 22nd. She called on Lucian Woodworth family while Joseph attended to some business at the temple. Emma apparently did not know that the Woodworth's 16-year-old daughter Flora had been Joseph's plural wife since spring. What probably began as a casual visit resulted in a confrontation between Emma and Flora when Emma discovered that Joseph had given Flora a gold watch. She would have recognized the implications of such a gift since he had also given one to Eliza Snow. Joseph returned just as Emma was demanding the gold watch from Flora, and he reprimanded her. Once in the carriage, however, Emma vented her own frustrations. Joseph told Clayton she continued her abuse after they arrived home and said he finally had to employ harsh measures to stop her, end quote. What those harsh measures were, we'll never know. Apparently, by the end of the summer of 1843, Emma's opposition to polygamy weakened. Alan J. Stout overheard a conversation between Joe and Emma and reported that Emma was, ping-ponged between moments of passionate denunciation and tearful repentance. Maria Jan Johnston told a similar story, quote, Emma was crying and in trouble about something. Emma invited the young woman to sit down on the bed. Emma looked very sad and cast down, but remarked, "The principle of plural marriage is right. It is from our Father in heaven." Maria Jane reported, "Then she again spoke of her jealousy. What I said I have got to repent of. The principle is right, but I am jealous-hearted. Now, never tell anybody that you heard me find fault with the principle. We have got to humble ourselves and repent of it," end quote. Joe had finally worn Emma down. In late 1843 and early 44, her behavior became more erratic. Finally, Emma said, quote, "Joseph should give us up or blood would flow," end quote. It's unclear who she was threatening to kill. Maybe she meant that she would commit suicide, but this was also concomitant with Joe's stomach ulcers, where he thought that Emma had poisoned him, or maybe she did poison him. We don't really know, but honestly, for everything that Joe put her through, I kind of wouldn't blame her. Regardless, this threat, the blood would flow, seems to have gotten her the upper hand again in her fights with Joe. And at last, Emma convinced Joe to end his marriage to the Partridge sisters, and she turned all of the female boarders out of the Smiths family mansion home. According to Emily Partridge, Joe became surprisingly submissive during all of this in the beginning of 1844. John Taylor records that Emma said Joe had admitted to her that the plural marriage revelation was false. Emma told a non-Mormon visitor that the doctrine of polygamy came straight from hell. In the end, Emma took a strong stand against polygamy, and Joe allowed her to because he probably didn't have any other options. After his death, the message of anti-polygamy became Emma's legacy when she led her children and several other Mormon factions away from Joseph's teachings on marriage and toward coalescing into the RLDS Church. She denied, even on her deathbed, that polygamy ever occurred in the church. And Emma remarried 3 years after Joe's death, on his birthday. And yes, I'm sure that the date selected was very deliberate. Now I know, dear listener, I've kept you for a long time today. 42 pages of script doesn't really fly by, even if you're listening at 1.5 speed. I know this was a grind to get through, and there was some really ugly subjects that we trudged through to get here. But please allow a brief conclusion in an attempt to kind of tie these threads together. There's a reason this has been our longest episode in the Road to Carthage series, and that's because Mormon polygamy is just a complicated topic. The information we discussed today has been systematically suppressed since before Joe even died. Polygamy was only practiced because so many men died on the trek west and the women needed to be careful. Joseph Smith never practiced polygamy. I've read in my scriptures and I don't remember reading anything about polygamy. These are generational lies that live to this day. I see posts nearly every day from people who are amazed at the fact that Emma wasn't Joseph's only wife because, the information was suppressed for them. And they never came into contact with that information. And all I can think of is, oh, just you wait, young grasshopper. Be careful, there be monsters in this here rabbit hole. With that said, I can't help but recognize the dogma on both sides of this issue. And I experienced the manifestation of that dogma firsthand this previous weekend during Sunstone, when a heated debate ensued among some history junkies about the morality of polygamy. It's a heated topic among historians and hobbyists alike, and the fact is that nobody can actually understand polygamy in its completeness. On one hand, we have Brian Hales in the Church Gospel Topic Essays making up presentist interpretations of evidence that, time means sex and eternity means no sex. And then on the other hand, we have people posting in all caps, Joe Bro raped a teenage girl, and they then can't name any of those survivors, or they have no idea what any of them did after his death. Many of those women who were Joe's wives went on to be the most vocal proponents of polygamy in Utah. So let's try and peel back that dogma and look at the naked Mormonism polygamy. It's really complicated. It started as a progressive system to buck the trend of puritanical family and gender dynamics. And I can appreciate the hell out of that. As the practice expanded and included more people, controls needed to be put into place, and power had to be consolidated in the prophet himself. He was the only one who could approve the people who knew about it and practiced it. Once that happened, women, much like Joe's revelations in New York and Kirtland, became a commodity, as if they weren't already perceived as commodities to begin with. But the endowment, as introduced by Joseph Smith, isn't fully understood by historians today. It involved people getting naked and drenched in oil with some plants infused into that oil, and then a passion narrative of the creation, an ascendancy ritual, and then a holding chamber for the initiates to enjoy in privacy after the ceremony was complete. The majority of people that Joe brought through the endowment were practicing polygamy, or they were being groomed to practice it. Suffice it to say, the Nauvoo Temple, had it been completed before Joe's death, would have become a rape castle. Once Bloody Brigham took over and round thousands of people through the temple in the space of just a few months before heading west, it served only the ritualistic purposes, and we have no evidence that any sexual encounters actually occurred there. But this is also Victorian puritanical America, so I don't know what evidence we would ever expect to find. The women may have confided in one another about the abuse that they were suffering, but they never wrote any of it down, at least not without coding their language. The few extant exposés we have of the Brigham endowment are troubling at best, but people didn't speak up about what was going on in the temple because the Danites were an ever-present threat. People would notice if anybody sent a letter to Warsaw or to Carthage that told about what was going on inside the theocracy of Nauvoo, and then the Danites would come knocking. The need for secrecy is one of the many factors which went into the formation of the Relief Society. Bennett's exposé discusses a hierarchy within the Relief Society of women ascending based on criteria like how attractive they were, or how well they could keep a secret, or how open they were to being sealed to other men and engage in open marriages, and some other criteria. These levels were first the Cyprian Saints, then the Chambered Sisters of Charity, and then finally, quote, the highest degree in the harem, end quote, were the consecratees of the cloister, or the cloistered saints. According to Bennett, quote, the members of the Female Relief Society who are ever upon the watch for victims have the power, when they know or even suspect that any Mormon female has lapsed from the straight path of virtue without the sanction of the prophet, of bringing her at once before the Inquisition. This body, Relief Society, is solemnly organized in secret and select council, and by its members the poor, terrified female is questioned and threatened until she confesses the crime she has committed, or perhaps in her confusion and terror accuses herself of what she was never guilty of, end quote. This pattern of grooming and mind control and abuse eventually results in the young Cyprian Saint's spirit being broken, her autonomy abused out of her. She's terrified and alone. She's castigated by women she considers friends and family, and she has nowhere else to turn. If she shows enough tenacity and fortitude to withstand this abusive onslaught, she ascends to the Chambered Sisters of Charity. Quote, this order comprises that class of females who indulge their sensual propensities without restraint, whether married or single, by the express permission of the prophet, end quote. So this group of women, when approached by a man that they seem to like, and the couple, they go to Joe, and he gives his approval, and then they are clandestinely married. Understandably, some women, like Eliza R. Snow and others who gained power through this structure, some women enjoyed the liberties that were afforded by polygamy, and they would fall into this second degree, the second category. But there was also the highest degree in the Relief Society, the cloistered saints. Quote, this degree is composed of females who, by an express grant and gift of God, are set apart and consecrated to the use and benefit of particular individuals as secret spiritual wives. They are the saints of the black veil and are accounted the special favorites of heaven. Their spiritual husbands are altogether the most eminent members of the Mormon Church and participate in the holiness of their consecrated wives. End quote. At its foundation, the Relief Society was formed to create a hierarchy, a structure of control, checks and balances within a massive system of clandestine polygamy. These cloistered saints were often just as criminal as Joe himself. They were the older and more trustworthy women who were able to convince younger women that polygamy was commanded of God and that the younger women should just submit to being raped. The mothers in Israel were part of these cloistered saints. These were the women who, according to a conversation that Joe had with Joseph H. Jackson, quote, were great captains in his service to carry his design, and remarked that through them he could get any stranger's money. I asked him how he would work the matter, to which he replied that he had only to tell certain of his spiritual wives that such a man had been in the Missouri War and that he should be put out of the way and his property and money consecrated to the use of the church. Then said he, it is damned easy for them to get on his good graces and to mix a white powder with his victuals and put him out of the way. End quote. These women had a lot of power to help build the kingdom of God. They were granted that power by showing special favors to the prophet and his best friends. They flourished in a system of overt and brazen criminality. And they all became victims of that system, but they were still able to flourish within it. Joseph Smith was a serial rapist and a serial criminal. He constructed entire theologies and ritualism for that purpose. And everybody who participated in it was a victim to his religious abuse. He was a cult leader, and cult leaders can accomplish incredibly dangerous and abusive things under the guise of religion. And even the participants themselves can feel like they are liberated by practicing it. He promised exaltation and eternal rewards for submitting to the system. If you bring even one soul to the gospel of polygamy, great shall be your glory. And many people flourished from that inherently abusive power dynamic. Which is also to say, there was a tremendous amount of variability. Some didn't see anything wrong with the system, or maybe even enjoyed the sexual liberty afforded by polygamy. It's a very complicated matter, and that's why we took 42 pages to just scratch the surface of it today. There are so many more stories that I could tell you about polygamy, but I was notified about a tweet from another polygamous cult leader, Russell M. Nelson. Dear friends, the road ahead may be bumpy, but our destination is serene and secure. So fasten your seatbelts, hang on through the bumps, and do what is right. Your reward will be eternal. Well, he's the mouthpiece of God, and we're lucky to have a modern-day pious fraud to tell us what's right. In any case, I talked at you for long enough. I'm going to go plan my wedding. This podcast is produced with the help of Julie Briscoe as social media manager and Brian Ziegenhagen as audio engineer. Music is written and produced by Jason Camo of aloststateofmind.bandcamp.com and used with permission. Legal counsel is provided by Andrew Torres of the law offices of P. Andrew Torres in the Opening Arguments podcast. Naked Mormonism is a production of Ground Gnomes LLC. Copyright 2020. All rights reserved.